Welcome back, my friend. Before we start the video, I really need your support. The channel is going through a tough time, and your help means everything. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone watching leaves just one like and one comment, we can easily make it happen. Don't forget to subscribe as well. And now, let's get started. The radio crackled to life at 4:47 a.m., dragging me from the kind of sleep you never really get back. Ranger, we've got a situation. 2 hikers, 26 hours overdue. Last known position near the old fire lookout on Kituwa Ridge. I sat up in the darkness of my cabin, already reaching for my boots. Kituwa, the name meant ancient place in Cherokee, and the locals had their own ideas about why certain parts of these woods carried such weight. 20 years as a park ranger, and I'd learned to separate superstition from legitimate danger. Usually, copy that, give me the details. The dispatcher's voice carried that particular tension that comes from too many hours watching a clock tick past the point where outcomes stay optimistic. Married couple, early 30s. David and Julie Brennan filed a day hike permit for the Kituwa Loop Trail, due back yesterday at 1600 hours. Vehicle still in the lot, cell phones going straight to voicemail. I pulled on my jacket, checking my pack by muscle memory. First aid kit, GPS, rope, emergency blanket, flares, water purification tablets, knife. The Kituwa Loop wasn't technical terrain, but it snaked through some of the densest old-growth forest in the park. People got turned around up there. The canopy grew so thick in places that your compass could spin lazy circles, confused by the magnetic anomalies in the ancient rock. I'm heading out now. Alert the volunteer search team for 0700 if I haven't made contact. Copy. Be careful up there. I almost asked what she meant by that, but I already knew. 3 searches in the past 14 months, all in the same general area. We'd found 2 of those people. The third, experienced wilderness photographer named Marcus Webb, had simply vanished. His camera was discovered at the base of a lightning-scarred oak, the lens shattered, the last photos showing nothing but blurred images of trees. The case file said he'd likely fallen during the night, injured himself, and succumbed to exposure in a ravine we hadn't found. But the search dogs had acted strangely that day, whining and refusing to follow certain trails, and Marcus's final photos bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate. The pre-dawn air bit at my face as I loaded my truck. Fog clung to the valley floor like something alive, shifting and reforming in my headlights as I navigated the access road. The ranger's station sat 5 miles from the main park entrance, deliberately isolated to minimize our impact on the wilderness we protected. Most mornings I appreciated the solitude. This morning the darkness felt heavier. The trailhead parking lot held 1 vehicle when I arrived, a blue Subaru with Colorado plates and a kayak rack. I ran the plates to confirm, registered to David Brennan. A quick look through the windows revealed what you'd expect. Hiking guides, a half-empty water bottle, a sweater tossed in the back seat. Normal. Everything was normal. Except for the smell I'd caught at the moment I stepped out of my truck. Something dead in the woods, probably a deer taken down by coyotes. But the scent carried an undertone that made my jaw tighten. Not rot exactly. Something more acrid, like burning hair mixed with spoiled meat. I keyed my radio. Dispatch. I'm at the trailhead. Beginning search pattern Alpha. The Kituwa Loop Trail started innocently enough, well-maintained, clearly marked, the kind of path that gave hikers confidence. That confidence usually lasted about 3 miles, right up until the trail forked at Widow's Creek. The left fork continued the loop, adding another 8 miles of moderate terrain. The right fork, unmarked, unofficial, and technically closed, led deeper into the backcountry, toward the old fire lookout tower that hadn't been manned since 1987. I found their first clue at the fork, a granola bar wrapper caught in the underbrush. Brand name stuff from REI. I bagged it and marked the location on my GPS. They'd taken the right fork. The trail deteriorated quickly once you left the official path. Fallen trees blocked the way, forcing you to scramble over moss-slicked bark or push through tangles of mountain laurel. I moved carefully, watching for any sign of passage. Boot prints in the mud near a seasonal stream. A broken branch at shoulder height, the white wood showing fresh beneath the bark. They'd come this way, moving with purpose. But about 2 miles in, something changed. The tracks became erratic. Instead of following the remains of the trail, they veered sharply left, plunging into thick forest where no sensible hiker would go. I knelt beside a clear print in the soft earth, Julie's, judging by the size, and noticed something that made my skin prickle. The depth of the impression was wrong, too deep. She'd been running. I stood slowly, scanning the forest around me. The normal sounds you'd expect, birdsong, the rustle of squirrels, the whisper of wind through leaves, were absent. The silence felt deliberate, like the woods were holding their breath. My radio crackled. Ranger checking in. What's your status? Following tracks heading off trail. approximately 2 miles past the fork. Subjects appear to have left the path abruptly. No visual contact yet. Copy. Search team is assembling. Should be with you by. The transmission dissolved into static, then cut out entirely. I checked the radio. Full battery, no damage. But when I keyed the mic again, nothing happened. Not even static. Communication failures weren't unusual in the deep backcountry. The ridgelines created dead zones, and solar flares occasionally wreaked havoc with electronics. But the timing felt wrong. I continued following the tracks, moving deeper into forest that grew increasingly primordial. The trees here were massive, oak and hickory and chestnut that had been standing when Cherokee hunters walked these hills. Their branches interlocked overhead, creating a twilight gloom even though dawn had fully broken. Every 50 yards or so, I marked a tree with reflective tape, ensuring I could find my way back. The smell grew stronger. That same burnt hair and rot combination, but concentrated now, almost choking. I pulled my bandana over my nose and mouth, breathing through the fabric. Then I saw the deer. It hung from a low branch about 30 feet ahead, suspended upside down by what looked like its own entrails. The carcass had been opened from throat to groin with surgical precision. The organs removed and arranged on the ground below in a pattern I didn't want to analyze too closely. The meat was too fresh for this to be the source of the smell. This kill was hours old at most. But no predator I knew did this. I photographed the scene, documenting everything while my mind raced through possibilities. Poachers? Possible. But the weird arrangement suggested something else. Some kind of ritual? The park occasionally dealt with people engaging in various spiritual practices, though they usually stuck to established clearings and didn't gut deer. Beyond the hanging carcass, I spotted something that made my heart rate spike. A piece of bright orange fabric caught on a thorn bush. Julie Brennan's jacket, according to the description in my notes. I bagged it carefully, noting the torn edge and what looked like blood on the collar. The tracks continued past this point, but they'd changed again. Now there were 3 sets of prints: David's boots, Julie's trail runners, and something else. Something with a strange elongated footprint that appeared almost human but not quite. The stride length was wrong, too long, unless the person making them had been moving at a dead sprint, and there were signs in the track of claws or nails dragging at the toe. My mouth went dry. I'd seen tracks like this once before, 14 months ago, when we'd been searching for Marcus Webb. Professional protocol said call it in, wait for backup, don't proceed alone into an unknown situation. But the Brennans had been missing for over 24 hours now, and these tracks were fresh. I had maybe a 3-hour window before those tracks would be useless if weather moved in. I pushed forward, hand resting on the canister of bear spray at my hip. Not that bear spray would do much good if this was what I was beginning to suspect. The old Cherokee word for it was Atsula, fire, but also corruption, a person who had forsaken their humanity. The Navajo called them skinwalkers, and the legends from a dozen tribes described similar creatures. People who had performed dark rituals to gain the ability to take animal form, to move through the forest with supernatural speed, to hunt with an intelligence that no natural predator possessed. I'd always filed such stories alongside Bigfoot and the Jersey Devil campfire tales, nothing more. But the park's oldest records, the ones that went back to the 1920s before Kittiwah Ridge was officially protected, told of disappearances, hunters who never came home, children who wandered into the woods and were found days later with no memory of where they'd been, speaking about the stick people who walked on 2 legs but wore animal skins. The tracks led to a clearing I'd never seen before, despite 2 decades of patrolling these woods. It shouldn't have existed. The forest here was too thick, too established, but there it was. A perfect circle of bare earth about 40 feet across, ringed by stones that looked deliberately placed. In the center stood a makeshift shelter, constructed from branches and bark, and what looked like strips of leather. And outside the shelter, clearly visible in the soft earth, Julie Brennan's trail runners, placed side by side, empty. I approached slowly, every sense on high alert. The shelter's entrance was a gap in the woven branches, just tall enough to admit a crouching person. I pulled my flashlight, casting the beam inside. The interior was larger than it should have been, dug partially into the earth to create a small den-like space. Sleeping bags, the Brennans I guessed, were spread in one corner. A camping stove, water bottles, all the gear you'd expect. But the walls were decorated with bones, small animal skulls mostly, but also ribs, vertebrae, and finger bones arranged in geometric patterns. And there were drawings, made with something dark and organic, depicting stick-figure humans, and something larger, something with 4 legs and a distorted head. I backed out of the shelter, heart hammering, and that's when I heard it. A sound like laughter, but wrong. Too high-pitched, with a clicking quality underneath, like someone or something imperfectly mimicking human speech. It came from the tree line on the far side of the clearing. "David," I called out. "Julie, I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help." The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then, from behind me, much closer than should have been possible, "Help." The voice sounded like Julie's, but there was something off about the cadence, like each syllable was being pronounced for the first time. I spun around. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and that oppressive watching silence. My radio crackled to life suddenly, making me jump. "Gurum, come in. Ranger, what's static?" Swallowed the rest. "Dispatch. I've found evidence of the missing hikers, but the situation is unclear. I need movement in my peripheral vision." I turned, bringing my flashlight up. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line. Human-shaped, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms too long. It wore something dark and ragged that might have been clothing, but when my light hit it, the material seemed to shift and writhe. We stared at each other for a moment that stretched like taffy. Then it smiled. I saw teeth. Too many teeth and eyes that reflected my flashlight beam with a greenish shine. "Help," it said again, in Julie Brennan's voice. And it started walking toward me on all fours. Training takes over when your conscious mind goes blank with terror. I didn't remember reaching for the bear spray, but suddenly it was in my hand. Safety off, finger on the trigger. The creature, and God help me, I couldn't think of it as anything else, was covering ground with horrifying speed, moving like a wolf but with joints that bent in ways that made my eyes hurt to track. I fired the spray in a wide arc. The orange mist caught it full in the face. It didn't even slow down. I ran. 20 years of hiking these woods meant I knew how to move through rough terrain, but panic made me clumsy. I crashed through underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, lungs already burning. Behind me I could hear it following, not crashing like I was, but moving with eerie silence, just the occasional crack of a twig to let me know it was there. Still hunting me. I broke through the tree line and half fell down a steep embankment, grabbing at roots and saplings to control my descent. Rocks scattered under my boots. My radio flew from my belt, bouncing away into the ravine below. I didn't stop to retrieve it. At the bottom I splashed through a creek I didn't recognize, the icy water shocking some clarity back into my thoughts. I needed to get to high ground, to open terrain where I could see what was coming. The density of the forest gave that thing every advantage. A sound above made me look up. The creature was at the top of the embankment, silhouetted against the gray morning sky. At this distance, with the light behind it, it looked almost human again. Almost. Then it dropped down the slope in a controlled slide that no human body could manage, moving on all fours with its spine arched in a way that defied anatomy. I scrambled up the opposite bank and kept running, making for higher ground. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but I didn't dare shed it. Everything in there might be the difference between life and death. The forest began to thin as I climbed. I recognized this area now, the southeastern slope of Kitawa Ridge, where a forest fire 20 years ago had cleared a swath of old growth. The younger trees here grew more sparsely, and patches of open ground broke up the canopy. Better visibility, better odds. I risked a glance behind me. Nothing visible, but I could feel it out there. Watching, circling. My lungs screamed for oxygen. I'd been running uphill for 15 minutes straight, and my legs were starting to shake with exhaustion. I needed to think, to plan, not just flee blindly like panicked prey. A memory surfaced. The old fire lookout tower. It couldn't be far from here. Maybe half a mile northeast. Steel construction, 40 feet tall, with an enclosed observation room at the top. If I could reach it, I could get above ground level, maybe establish line of sight for my radio to work, call in backup. If the tower was still standing after 38 years of neglect, I changed direction, navigating by the sun and the lay of the land. The creature let me run. I could sense it pacing me, staying just out of sight but close enough that I heard the occasional rustle of movement, playing with me. That thought was somehow worse than everything else, the idea that it was intelligent enough to toy with its prey, to understand fear and enjoy it. The tower appeared through the trees like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. The metal was rust orange and streaked with decades of weather, but the structure looked intact. The wooden stairs that had once provided access had rotted away, leaving just the metal framework. I'd have to climb. I grabbed the first crossbeam and pulled myself up. The metal was rough with corrosion, biting into my palms. I didn't care. Hand over hand, I climbed, muscles burning, refusing to look down or back. 20 feet up. 30. The observation room's trapdoor hung open on broken hinges. I grabbed the frame and hauled myself through, rolling onto the floor of the small enclosed space. For a moment I just lay there gasping, staring at the ceiling. The room was maybe 10 feet square with windows on all sides, most of the glass long gone. Pine needles and bird droppings covered the floor. An old desk stood in one corner, and a rusted filing cabinet in another. Maps on the walls had faded to near invisibility. I forced myself to my feet and looked out the windows. From this height I could see for miles the endless carpet of forest, the ridge line to the north, the faint thread of the main trail far below. Beautiful country, deadly country. Movement caught my eye. Down at the base of the tower, the creature emerged from the tree line. In full daylight, without the distortion of panic, I could see it more clearly. It was wearing skins, deer hide, I thought, crudely stitched together into a kind of cloak. But underneath, the body was wrong. The spine too flexible, the limbs too long, the face. I pulled back from the window, stomach churning. The face had looked human at first glance, but the features were subtly distorted, like a mask that didn't quite fit. And the eyes, those eyes were pure animal, glinting with intelligence and hunger. It circled the base of the tower once, twice, studying the structure. Then it placed one long-fingered hand on a crossbeam and began to climb. My hand went to my belt, instinctively reaching for the radio that was gone. I had my knife, my first aid kit, and I checked half a bottle of water. No weapons, no way to call for help. And that thing was climbing toward me with smooth, practiced movements. I looked around desperately. The trapdoor wouldn't close, the hinges were broken. Even if it did, the wood was rotten. It wouldn't hold. The windows offered no escape except a 40-foot drop onto rocks and roots. The filing cabinet. It was metal, heavy, and positioned near the trapdoor. I put my shoulder against it and pushed with everything I had. The cabinet barely moved, scraping across the floor with a tortured squeal. I pushed again, harder, feeling something tear in my lower back. The cabinet grudged forward another foot. Below me, the climbing sounds had stopped. I froze, listening. Had it given up, fallen, or was it just... A hand shot through the trapdoor opening, grabbing at the air where my ankle had been a second before. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The hand was human-shaped but covered in coarse hair, the nails thick and yellow like claws. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, an ancient fire extinguisher, and brought it down on the hand with all my strength. There was a crack and the hand withdrew with a sound that might have been a hiss or might have been a scream. Then silence again. I stood there, heart hammering, the fire extinguisher raised and ready. Minutes crawled by. The sun climbed higher, sending shafts of light through the broken windows. Dust motes danced in the beams. Everything was still. Too still. I edged toward a window, trying to see down to the base of the tower. Was it waiting there? Had it climbed back down? The attack came from behind me. It must have climbed the outside of the tower, moving around to one of the window openings. I caught just a glimpse of that distorted face, those animal eyes, before it was through the window and inside the room with me. We collided and I discovered just how strong it was. The impact slammed me into the desk, which collapsed under our combined weight. I rolled, bringing my knife up, and felt the blade bite into something solid. Dark blood, almost black, splattered across the floor. The creature recoiled, and I scrambled away, putting the broken desk between us. It crouched low, studying me with those terrible eyes. This close, I could see that the deer hide wasn't just draped over it. It seemed to be part of it somehow, merged with flesh in a way that made my skin crawl. "What are you?" The words came out before I could stop them. It tilted its head, considering. When it spoke, the voice was different from before, deeper, rougher, but still with that quality of imperfect imitation. "Ranger." My blood turned to ice. It knew what I was. It had been watching, learning, maybe for days or weeks or longer. "Where are David and Julie Brennan?" The creature's lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile. It raised one hand, the one I'd hit with the fire extinguisher, now showing darkening bruises, and pointed down toward the forest floor. "Gone." The word hung in the air between us. Gone. Not dead, not killed. Gone. As if they'd been erased, or taken somewhere I couldn't follow. "You killed them." "Changed." It said the word carefully, like testing the fit of new clothing. "Like me. Like you will be." It moved then, faster than thought, and suddenly we were grappling again. Its strength was impossible. And the smell, God, the smell up close was overwhelming. Rot and musk and something chemical that made my eyes water. I drove my knife in again, aiming for the chest, but the blade skittered off something hard beneath the hide. We crashed through one of the window frames, and for a terrifying moment we were both falling, tumbling through empty air. My hand found a crossbeam, and I grabbed it, arresting my fall with a bone-jarring impact that nearly tore my arm from its socket. The creature fell past me, but it was already twisting mid-air, cat-like, to land on a lower beam. I hung there gasping, my shoulder screaming in pain. Below, the creature crouched on its perch watching me, calculating. Then, from the forest, I heard voices. Human voices. The search and rescue team had arrived. The creature heard them too. Its head snapped around, and for just a moment I saw something in those animal eyes that might have been fear, or maybe just annoyance at interrupted hunting. It dropped from the beam, landed in a crouch that should have shattered bones, and loped off into the forest. Within seconds it had vanished into the undergrowth as completely as if it had never existed. I held on to the crossbeam, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Below, the voices grew closer. I recognized Carson's voice. He was lead on the volunteer search team, ex-military, competent and level-headed. Up here, I managed to shout, on the tower. It took them 20 minutes to rig a safe way to get me down. By then the adrenaline had worn off and I was shaking so badly I could barely hold on. Carson took one look at my face and knew something catastrophic had happened. Jesus, what did you run into? You look like you fought a bear. Not a bear, I said. My voice sounded strange, distant. Did you see anyone else out here? Anyone running from the area? Negative. We came straight up from the trailhead. You're the first person we've seen. He was looking at me with growing concern. What happened? Where are the Brennans? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I had no idea what to say. If I told the truth that I'd been attacked by something wearing animal skins, something that might once have been human, they'd think the stress had broken me. But if I lied, if I didn't warn them about what was out there, we need to search the area around coordinates. I checked my GPS, which miraculously still worked. 34.8421 by -83.2195. There's a clearing there with a shelter. Evidence of the missing hikers, and signs of, I hesitated, possible hostile wildlife activity. Carson's eyes narrowed. He'd been doing search and rescue for 15 years. He knew I was holding something back, but he also knew better than to push when someone looked as shaken as I did. Copy that, we'll check it out. But first, let's get you back to base. You need medical attention. I wanted to argue, to go back out there immediately and find out what had happened to the Brennans, but my body was shutting down, shock and exhaustion catching up with me. I let them guide me back down the trail, half walking, half carried, when my legs gave out. Behind us, the forest was silent, watching. And somewhere in those ancient woods, something that had once been human was deciding what to do about the ranger who had gotten away. The clinic doctor diagnosed me with multiple contusions, a sprained shoulder, and what she tactfully called acute stress response. She wanted to keep me overnight for observation. I refused. Every minute I spent in that antiseptic room with its cheerful posters about tick prevention was another minute. Something inhuman was loose in my park. Sheriff Dawes arrived while the doctor was wrapping my shoulder. He was a weathered man in his 60s who'd worked these counties long enough to have his own theories about what went on in the deep woods. Theories he usually kept to himself unless he was 3 beers in at McNally's bar. Hell of a morning you had, he said, settling into the chair beside my exam bed. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Not the defensive wounds on my hands, not the way I kept glancing toward the window, not the knife I'd refused to let the nurses take. That's one way to put it. Want to tell me what really happened out there? I'd spent the walk back rehearsing my story, getting it as close to the truth as I could without sounding insane. I found evidence the Brennans had made camp in an unauthorized area. Signs of something predatory in the vicinity. Could be a bear, could be a mountain lion. I had a close encounter, defensive posture, no actual attack, but it was enough to send me up the old fire tower. Uh-huh. Dawes leaned back, fingers drumming on his knee. And the search team found this camp? Should have. I gave them the coordinates. They found it all right. Strange place, real strange. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos. The clearing looked different in afternoon light, less ominous, but the bone decorations in the shelter were clearly visible. Lab boys are analyzing some of the biological material. Whatever made that shelter, it wasn't just passing through. It's been there a while, adding to its collection. What about the Brennans? No sign, but we found their camping gear, and we found blood. Type matches Julie Brennan's medical records. He swiped to another photo, and we found these. The image showed tracks in the mud. 3 distinct sets, exactly like I'd seen. David's, Julie's, and the others. The ones that weren't quite human. Your mountain lion have a foot deformity? I met his eyes. Sheriff, in your experience, what makes those kinds of tracks? A long pause. Then, in my official capacity as county sheriff, no idea, never seen anything like it. Another pause. In my capacity as someone whose grandfather was Cherokee and told stories about what lives in these mountains, I'd say you're damn lucky to be sitting here talking to me. The search team was out there right now with instructions to work in groups of no less than 4, stay on marked trails, and pull back before sunset. I'm not risking more people. He stood up, preparing to leave. You should get some rest. Real rest, not this white-knuckling it in a clinic bed. Whatever you saw out there, it's not your problem alone anymore. But it was. I knew it was. Because whatever that thing was, it had looked at me with recognition, had spoken to me, had marked me somehow. And the Brennans were still missing. Maybe dead, maybe worse. After Dawes left, I checked myself out against medical advice and drove to the ranger station. The building was nearly empty. Most of my colleagues were either out on the search or off duty. Perfect. I needed access to the archives, and I needed to not answer questions about why. The station's record room occupied a basement corner that smelled of mildew and aging paper. Filing cabinets lined the walls, stuffed with decades of incident reports, wildlife surveys, and historical documentation from before the land became protected. I started with the obvious search term, missing persons. The first case dated back to 1983. A hunting party of 3 men had set out for a weekend in what was then unprotected wilderness. Only one came back. His statement, transcribed in shaky handwriting, described an animal attack. But the details were wrong for any known predator. The survivor mentioned eyes that looked at me like it was thinking, and sounds like my dead brother's voice calling from the trees. The sheriff at the time had written exposure-induced hallucination in the margin. 1987, a park ranger, one of my predecessors, had filed a report about finding mutilated deer carcasses arranged in patterns. His supervisor had dismissed it as poachers. The ranger had quit 2 weeks later. No follow-up investigation. 1991, 3 hikers reported being followed by something walking on 2 legs but not quite human. They'd made it back to their vehicle, packed up, and never returned. The report had been filed under wildlife encounter unspecified. 1995, 1998, 2003, 2007. The pattern continued. Every few years, something would happen, someone would see something, or someone would disappear. The reports were always filed, always explained away, always forgotten. Until Marcus Webb, in 2023. I pulled his file and spread it across the table. The official report listed him as lost, presumed dead due to exposure. But clipped to the back were the photos from his camera, the ones I'd seen during the original investigation but hadn't really looked at closely. I looked at them now. Most were standard landscape shots, forest vistas, close-ups of flowers, a black bear at a distance, professional quality work. But the final dozen images told a different story. They became increasingly blurred as if taken while moving. Trees, shadows, more trees, then a series of shots that appeared to show something moving between the trunks, but the motion blur made it impossible to make out details. The second-to-last photo showed a clearing I recognized, the same one where I'd found the shelter. The last photo was of Marcus Webb's own face. Except his expression was wrong, too calm, and his eyes, even in the grainy digital image, his eyes looked different, reflective, almost animal-like. The file slipped from my hands. I sat there in the dim basement, surrounded by decades of ignored warnings, and understood with horrible clarity what the creature had meant when it said the Brennans were changed. My phone buzzed. Carson, texting from the search area. Need you out here. Found something. Not good. I was in my truck and driving before I'd fully processed the decision to go. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that I was making a mistake, that I should wait for backup, that I was in no condition to go back out there. But Carson wouldn't have called unless it was urgent, and I knew these woods better than anyone. The sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon as I reached the trailhead. Maybe 4 hours of daylight left. I grabbed my flashlight, checked my knife, and added a road flare to my belt. Not much in the way of weapons, but it was what I had. I found Carson and 2 other team members at the edge of the clearing, their faces pale. "Show me," I said. He led me past the shelter to the far side of the clearing, where the ground sloped down toward a rocky outcrop, and there, partially hidden by ferns, were 2 more shelters, smaller than the first, more crudely constructed. "We did a thermal scan," Carson said quietly. "There's heat signatures inside both of them." The implication settled over me like a physical weight. "Did you look inside?" "No. Waiting for you." He handed me a thermal scope. "But you should see this first." I raised the scope to my eye. The shelters glowed bright yellow and red and infrared, definite heat sources, but the signatures were wrong. They flickered and moved in ways that suggested the occupants were conscious and active, but the body temperatures were reading low, closer to large animals than humans. "David and Julie Brennan?" one of the other searchers asked, his voice hopeful despite everything. I lowered the scope. Maybe what's left of them. I approached the nearest shelter slowly, announcing myself. "This is the Park Service. If you can hear me, come out slowly with your hands visible." No response. I crouched down, shining my flashlight through the entrance. The thing inside turned to look at me with eyes that caught my flashlight beam and threw it back green gold. It was curled in the back of the shelter, and for just a moment I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote that had denned here. Then it shifted, and I saw it was wearing the torn remains of a hiking shirt. David Brennan's hiking shirt, according to the description in the missing persons file. David? I kept my voice low, non-threatening. Can you understand me? The creature, and I couldn't think of it as anything else, cocked its head considering. Its face was a nightmare hybrid of human and animal features, bones restructured beneath skin that looked too tight, too gray. But the eyes, there was something in the eyes that might still be human. Recognition, and terrible, endless suffering. It opened its mouth, and what came out was a sound between a whimper and a growl. Behind me, I heard Carson's sharp intake of breath. What the hell is that? Get back, I said. All of you. Get back to the tree line. We can't just leave. Now. They retreated, and I understood why some part of me had known they needed to. Because David Brennan, if this thing was still David Brennan in any meaningful sense, was beyond our help. The transformation was too far along. The thing he'd become was what I'd fought in the fire tower, what had hunted the missing photographer, what had probably been preying on hikers in these woods for decades or longer. The creature in Julie's shelter was even further along, barely recognizable as anything that had once been human. I'm sorry, I whispered to both of them, to everyone who'd disappeared in these woods and met this fate. Then I backed away carefully, never turning my back until I was with the others at the tree line. What do we do? Carson asked. His hand rested on his radio, ready to call in whatever response I authorized. We contain the area, no one else comes here, and we wait for nightfall. Why nightfall? Because I remembered the creature in the tower, how it had fled at the sound of human voices, how it had vanished into the forest with predatory grace. Because whatever these things were, they hunted at night, and if we were going to end this, we needed to do it when they were active, when we could track them. When I could find the one that had started this. Because, I said, watching the sun slide toward the ridgeline, that's when they'll lead us to their nest. We made camp in a defensible position on a rocky outcrop that gave us a view of both shelters and the surrounding forest. Carson had brought proper equipment, motion sensors, night vision gear, flares, and something he'd called deterrents when he handed me a roadside emergency kit modified to produce intense bursts of magnesium bright light. Military surplus, he explained. We use them in Afghanistan for night operations. They blind predators, disorient them. Gives you maybe 10 seconds to relocate or prepare for engagement. Engagement. The word tasted clinical. Insufficient. What we were facing wasn't enemy combatants or even hostile wildlife. It was something that had once been human, transformed by means I didn't understand into something that wore human memories like a costume. The other two searchers, Rodriguez and Chen, were setting up a perimeter when the sun finally dipped below the ridgeline. The temperature dropped immediately, that particular mountain country cold that seeps into your bones. But it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. Motion on the thermal. Rodriguez called out softly. Southeast shelter. Something's moving. I raised my night vision scope. The world turned green-white, shadows becoming inverted valleys of darkness against glowing foliage. The shelter's entrance showed movement, something crawling out, slow and deliberate. David Brennan's transformed body emerged into the clearing. In night vision, the wrongness of its anatomy was even more apparent. The spine had an extra articulation allowing it to move with serpentine flexibility. The limbs had elongated joints reversed in ways that suggested more than human anatomy at work. But the clothing still clung to it in places, tragic reminders of what it had been. Jesus Christ, Chen whispered. Do not engage, I said firmly. We watch, we learn where they go. The second shelter began to stir. Julie's transformed form joined to David's, and the two creatures circled each other briefly in what might have been recognition or merely animal pack behavior. Then, moving as one, they headed into the forest, not toward us but north, deeper into the wilderness. They're moving away from the trails, Carson observed, away from where people would be. That bothered me more than if they'd headed toward the campgrounds. It suggested intelligence, planning. They weren't mindless predators. They were something far more dangerous. We follow. Maintain 50-yard distance. Rodriguez, you're on point. Chen, bring up the rear. Everyone stays in visual contact. If we get separated, we regroup here. If something goes wrong, we light them up and run like hell, Carson finished. Yeah, I got the mission parameters. We moved through the night forest like ghosts ourselves. Trained muscle memory, overriding the primal instinct that screamed at us to go anywhere but forward. The creatures were easy to track. Their thermal signatures glowed through the trees, and they moved with eerie confidence, never checking behind them. Why would they? In their experience, they were apex predators. They didn't know we were hunting them. The terrain grew rougher as we climbed. We were heading upridge, into country that hadn't seen regular human presence in decades. Ancient trees towered above us, their branches forming a canopy so dense that even starlight couldn't penetrate. The only illumination came from our equipment and the faint bioluminescence of foxfire fungus growing on dead wood. Rodriguez froze, hand up in the halt signal. Through my earpiece, his voice came through barely above a whisper. Multiple heat signatures ahead. At least 6, maybe more. 6. 6 more creatures like the Brennans. 6 more people who disappeared over the years, transformed into something that now gathered in the deepest part of the forest for purposes I could only guess at. We crept forward until we could see what Rodriguez had spotted. The creatures had gathered in a natural amphitheater formed by fallen trees and exposed rock, and they weren't alone. In the center of the gathering, bound with what looked like strips of bark, were 2 more humans, still human, not yet transformed. A man and a woman, both unconscious or barely conscious, slumped against each other. New victims, Carson breathed. They haven't been changed yet. Which meant we had a chance. If we could extract those people before the transformation process progressed too far, maybe they could be saved. But 6 of those things against 4 of us, even with weapons and training. Then I saw it. An understanding crystallized with horrible clarity. At the far edge of the gathering stood the creature I'd fought in the fire tower. Even among its own kind, it was different. Larger, more fully transformed, moving with an authority that suggested leadership. It was the Alpha, the one that had started this cycle of infection and transformation, and it was looking directly at our position. "It knows we're here," I said. "Everyone. Weapons ready." The attack came from behind. Chen's scream cut off abruptly as something grabbed him, dragging him backward into the undergrowth with terrifying speed. Rodriguez spun, bringing up his rifle, but another creature exploded from the shadows and took him down. His finger found the trigger on the way down, and the gunshot shattered the night's silence. All hell broke loose. The creatures in the amphitheater scattered, moving with inhuman speed. Carson and I were running before conscious thought, pelting toward the captive humans while chaos erupted around us. I heard more gunshots, screams, and sounds that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. We reached the captives as the alpha creature materialized in front of us, blocking our path. Up close, even partially transformed, I could see traces of what it had once been, the shape of its face suggesting European descent, the fragments of what looked like very old clothing still clinging to its body. This wasn't something recent. This creature had been here for years, maybe decades. "You shouldn't have come," it said, and this time the voice was almost human. Almost. Carson fired his weapon point blank into its chest. The impact should have killed it. Instead, it staggered back, looked down at the wound with what might have been annoyance, and lunged. I hit the emergency light. The magnesium flare exploded with a brilliance that turned night into day, and the creature recoiled, clawing at its eyes. I didn't waste the advantage. I grabbed one of the captives, the woman, and hauled her over my shoulder. Carson got the man, and we were moving, crashing through undergrowth with no thought for stealth or dignity, just desperate speed. Behind us, the forest erupted with howls. They were coming. All of them. "The ridge," I gasped. "We get to the ridge. We'll have line of sight. We can call." Something hit me from the side, and I was airborne. The woman torn from my grip. I landed hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. When I looked up, 3 of the creatures stood between me and my companions. David and Julie Brennan. And Marcus Webb. Or what they'd become. They approached slowly, heads tilted in that unnerving way, studying me like I was a specimen. Behind them I could hear Carson fighting, could hear the wet sounds of violence that meant at least one of us was already beyond help. "Change," Marcus Webb's transformed body said, gesturing to me. "Join, hunt, forever." And I understood then what they were offering. Not death. They could kill me anytime. They were offering transformation, a chance to become what they were, to join their pack, to shed humanity like old skin, and embrace something older, something that had lived in these mountains long before the Cherokee gave it names. Part of me, God help me, part of me, almost wanted to say yes, to stop running, stop fighting, to just let go of everything that made me human and afraid. That's what they counted on. That's how they recruited. They found people at their breaking point and offered them a way out. I thought of the Brennans, holding hands as they'd hiked up the trail just days ago. I thought of Marcus Webb, a talented photographer with a family waiting for him. I thought of every missing person whose file sat in the station's basement, their loved ones still hoping for answers. "No," I said. I triggered the second emergency light. The explosion of radiance sent the creatures reeling backward, and I was up and running before the light faded. Carson was ahead of me, stumbling, blood streaming from his shoulder but still moving. The captive man was gone, either dead or taken. I couldn't tell. The woman was still breathing, slung across Carson's back. We burst out of the tree line onto the ridge just as my radio crackled to life with blessed static. Anyone, this is dispatch. We have... Dispatch. This is emergency. Multiple casualties. Officer needs assistance. Coordinates. I read off our GPS position while running. Lungs burning, legs screaming. Carson set the woman down in a clear area and immediately began first aid. I stood guard, knife in one hand, final emergency light in the other, watching the tree line. They didn't follow. I waited, heart hammering, every shadow a potential threat. But the creatures stayed just inside the forest, a line of yellow-green eyes reflecting what little starlight reached the ground. Watching, calculating. The alpha emerged from the center of the line, moving on two legs now in a mockery of human posture. It pointed one elongated finger directly at me. Next time, it said. Then they melted back into the forest, disappearing as completely as if they'd never existed. Helicopter rotors sounded in the distance, growing closer. Carson was holding pressure on the woman's wounds, checking her vital signs. She's alive, unconscious but alive. Whatever they were doing to her, we got here in time. Rodriguez, Chen. His silence was answer enough. The helicopter's spotlight found us, turning the ridge into a stage of harsh white light. I shielded my eyes and looked back at the forest one final time. The eyes were gone, but I could feel them out there still, watching, waiting, remembering my face. The official report listed Rodriguez and Chen as victims of a wildlife attack. A bear, they decided, despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. The woman we'd rescued, whose name was Angela Morrison, had been hiking solo when she'd encountered something unusual. Her statement was deliberately vague, influenced by the trauma counselors who assured her that whatever she thought she remembered was likely stress-induced hallucination. I didn't correct her. Sometimes mercy comes in the form of plausible deniability. Sheriff Dawes closed the case on the Brennans after the search team found remains in a remote ravine. Remains that I knew weren't theirs, but came from some poor animal the creatures had planted there. The official story gave the families closure. The truth would have destroyed them. They gave me 3 weeks medical leave. I took one, spending it in the station archives, cross-referencing every disappearance, every strange sighting, every dismissed report going back to the 1920s. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. The creatures operated on a cycle, years of quiet, then a flurry of activity, then quiet again, as if they were growing their pack, then retreating to digest their gains. But this time felt different. This time they'd been interrupted. This time someone had survived who understood what they were. The Alpha knew I was a threat, and I knew it wouldn't let that stand. On my 8th day back, I was doing routine trail maintenance near Widow's Creek when I found the first message. The deer carcass was arranged exactly like the one I'd seen before, opened from throat to groin, organs displayed in patterns that suggested both ritual and warning. But this time something else had been added, my ranger badge, placed carefully atop the arrangement like an offering or a threat. I'd lost it during the fight in the amphitheater. I picked it up carefully, noting the scratches on the metal. The way it had been deliberately positioned for me to find. They were watching my patrol routes, learning my habits. The second message came 3 days later. My personal backpack, the one I kept in my truck. It had been taken sometime during the night and left hanging from a tree branch near the old fire tower. Everything was still inside. Wallet, keys, phone. But the message was clear. They could reach me anywhere, anytime. That night I didn't go home to my cabin. I stayed at the station. Doors locked, lights on, weapon within reach. Around 3 a.m. I heard something outside, movement, the crunch of gravel in the parking lot. I looked out through the blinds and saw nothing. But in the morning, there were tracks in the dirt, the wrong kind of tracks. Sheriff Dawes came by around noon, looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. "We need to talk," he said, and his tone made it clear this wasn't a social visit. He spread a folder across my desk. 3 more missing persons reports in the past week. Hikers, all experienced, all disappeared in the general area you were searching. And this morning someone found a shelter just like the ones you described, about 2 miles from the main campground. My stomach dropped. The campground? That's prime tourist area. Families camp there. I know, which is why I'm shutting down that entire section of the park effective immediately. But I need you to tell me the truth now, all of it. What exactly are we dealing with? I told him everything. He listened without interruption, his face growing more grim with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. My grandfather called them Nunahi, he finally said, the people who live anywhere. Cherokee legends say they were spirits who could take any form, who lived in the deepest mountains and only showed themselves when they chose. But the old stories also said they were dangerous, that if you got too close, if you learned their secrets, you became one of them. That fits what I've seen. The transformation, the pack behavior. The legends also say there's only one way to stop them. He pulled something from his jacket, a small leather pouch worn with age. My grandfather gave this to me before he died. Said if I ever encountered one of the Nunahai I should use it. It's tobacco mixed with specific herbs, blessed in a certain way. You burn it and it creates a barrier they can't cross. I took the pouch carefully. Does it work? My grandfather believed it did. That's good enough for me. That night, I went back to my cabin for the first time in days. I was done running. If the creatures wanted me, they knew where to find me, but I was going to be ready. I spread the blessed tobacco mixture around the perimeter of the cabin, following Doss's instructions exactly. Then I settled in to wait, knife on the table, rifle by the door, every light in the place blazing. They came at 2:47 a.m. I heard them first, movement outside the cabin, circling, testing. Then the scratching started, claws on wood, on glass, probing for weakness. A face appeared at the window. David Brennan's transformed visage, pressed against the glass, studying me with those terrible animal eyes. Then more faces. Julie, Marcus, others I didn't recognize. They surrounded the cabin, a pack of 6 or 7, and I understood that this was it. This was the confrontation the Alpha had promised. But they didn't attack. They couldn't cross the barrier the tobacco had created. They paced and circled and watched, but something kept them at bay. Then the Alpha arrived. I saw it coming down the dirt road to my cabin, moving upright now, almost human in posture. It stopped at the edge of my property and looked at the cabin, at me visible through the window, at the barrier I'd created. Then it smiled. It reached down and picked up a fist-sized rock, and threw it. The window exploded inward, glass showering across my living room. The barrier was broken. They poured through the opening. I fired the rifle until it clicked empty, then grabbed the knife. The first creature threw took the blade in the throat, Marcus Webb, or what he'd become. He went down but didn't die, just thrashed on my floor, dark blood spreading. The others kept coming. I was dimly aware of fighting, of pain, of impacts that would leave bruises if I survived. The emergency light flared, buying me seconds. I made it to the door, got outside, and ran. Behind me, the cabin erupted in flames. Had I knocked over a lamp? Had the magnesium flare ignited something? I didn't know and didn't care. I just ran. The creatures close behind, their howls mixing with the roar of the fire. I ran toward the only place I thought might offer shelter, the old fire tower. The irony wasn't lost on me, fleeing to the same place where this had all started. But the tower was steel, harder to breach than wood, and more importantly, I had a plan. The creatures were faster than me, but I had a head start. I reached the tower and scrambled up the framework, hands slipping on dew-slick metal. Behind me they gathered at the base, looking up. The Alpha began to climb. I made it to the observation room and immediately went to work on the plan I'd formulated. The room was still full of old papers, dried wood, decades of accumulated debris. I piled it in the center, added some broken furniture, then struck a match. The fire caught quickly, smoke beginning to pour from the windows. The Alpha reached the trapdoor just as the flames really took hold. It pulled itself up, saw what I'd done, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty in those animal eyes. "You want me changed?" I shouted over the roar of the flames. "You want me to be like you? Then come get me." It advanced, and I backed away, circling the room, keeping the fire between us. The heat was becoming intense, the metal walls beginning to glow. This tower was going to become a furnace, and we'd both die here if this didn't work. The creature lunged, and I sidestepped, letting its momentum carry it past me toward the window, toward the 40-foot drop. It caught itself on the frame, balanced precariously, and I had one chance. I charged, hitting it with my full weight. We both went through the window, falling, spinning, the ground rushing up. We hit one of the lower crossbeams. The creature took the impact first, its body cushioning mine. We bounced, separated, and I grabbed wildly, catching another beam. The creature wasn't so lucky. It continued falling, hit the ground with a crack that echoed through the forest. I hung there, shoulders screaming, and watched. The Alpha tried to rise but couldn't. Its back was broken, legs twisted at wrong angles. Around it the other creatures gathered, making sounds I'd never heard from them before. Distress, maybe, or confusion. Above me, the observation room was fully engulfed. The metal was buckling from the heat, and I knew I had maybe minutes before the whole structure came down. I dropped to a lower beam, then another, climbing down as quickly as I dared. When I reached the bottom, the creatures ignored me. They were focused entirely on their fallen leader, circling it, whimpering. The alpha looked at me one final time, and its expression, God help me, its expression was almost grateful, as if dying was a release from something it had endured for far too long. End it, it whispered. I picked up a piece of fallen metal, sharp-edged from the corroded framework. I didn't think, I just acted. The creature died, and when it did, something changed in the others. The intelligence left their eyes. They scattered into the forest, moving on instinct now. No longer a coordinated pack, but simple animals. The tower collapsed 5 minutes later, sending a plume of sparks into the night sky. I sat at a safe distance, watching it burn, too exhausted to move. Sheriff Dawes found me there at dawn, surrounded by the smoke and ruins of my stand. Is it done? He asked. For now, I said. The alpha is dead. The others, they're just animals now. Dangerous but not organized, not recruiting. And the 3 missing hikers? I thought of Angela Morrison, who we'd saved. Then I thought of Rodriguez and Chen, who we hadn't. If we find them in the next day or two before the transformation completes, maybe they can be saved. After that, he nodded grimly. I'll organize a search, properly armed this time. They found 2 of the missing hikers, 36 hours later, confused and traumatized but human. The 3rd was never found. I try not to think about what that means. 3 months later, I'm still a ranger at Kitawah Ridge. The park has implemented new safety protocols, mandatory check-ins, restricted access to certain areas, armed patrols after dark. The official story is that we're dealing with aggressive wildlife, possibly a rabid bear or mountain lion. I file reports, lead nature walks, teach tourists how to properly store food away from their campsites. Normal ranger things. But at night I listen to the forest, and sometimes, very rarely, I hear sounds that aren't quite animal and aren't quite human. Echoes of what happened, maybe, or warnings of what might come again. Because I know the truth. The alpha is dead, but the cycle predates him by decades, maybe centuries. Eventually, someone else will wander too deep into the old woods. Eventually, someone else will be desperate enough, or broken enough to accept the transformation when it's offered. And when that happens, a new alpha will rise. I keep the blessed tobacco close, I keep my knife sharp, and I watch the tree line. Because that's what a ranger does. We protect people from the wilderness. And sometimes we protect them from what lives in the spaces between the trees, the things that remember what we've forgotten, the things that were here before we gave these mountains names. The Nunhethi skinwalkers, the people who live anywhere. They're still out there, and they're always watching, always waiting, always patient. The radio crackled to life at 4:47 a.m., pulling me from a dream about my grandmother's hands weaving river cane into baskets. Her fingers moved in patterns passed down through 7 generations of our family, the same bloodline that traced back to the ancient towns along the Tuckasegee. I reached for the handset in the darkness of my ranger station, my mind still half tangled in the dream. "Wahali, you there?" It was dispatch. Janet's voice carried that particular tension that meant someone was already in trouble. "I'm here." I sat up, pulling on my boots. Outside, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park stretched out in absolute darkness, 500,000 acres of old-growth forest where cell signals died and people disappeared with disturbing regularity. "We've got a situation. Family of 3, the Hendersons from Michigan. Didn't check in at their campsite last night. They were supposed to be at Buckhorn Creek, but we've got nothing. Last ping on their emergency beacon was near Cataloochee Valley around 11 p.m., then it went dead. I was already moving, grabbing my pack from its hook. That's 8 miles from their registered site." "I know." Janet paused. "Wahali, there's something else. A hiker came into the visitor center about an hour ago. Solo backpacker, pretty shaken up. Said he heard something following him near Midnight Hole last night. Something big." My hand stilled on my flashlight. "Did he see it?" "No. But he said the woods went completely silent before it started. You know what that means." I did. My grandfather had taught me what it meant when the forest stopped making noise, when the insects ceased their chirping and the owls stopped calling, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It meant something had entered the woods that didn't belong there. Something the forest itself feared. "I'm heading out now," I said. "Have you contacted?" "Search and rescue is mobilizing, but they won't be ready to deploy until first light. You're our closest responder. I'm sending you the last known coordinates now." The GPS coordinates appeared on my phone screen. 35.6644 C, NEN, 83.0890. W. Deep in the backcountry, nowhere near any established trail. My stomach tightened. I loaded my pack with essentials, water filtration system, first aid kit, emergency blanket, rope, flares, and my grandfather's hunting knife. The blade was old, the handle wrapped in leather that had molded to my hand over the years. Before he died, he'd told me stories about the Nun-You-Know-Why, the Stone Man, and other beings that walked the old mountains. I dismissed them as folklore, the kind of stories elders tell to keep children from wandering too far from camp. That was before I became a ranger. Before I started finding things in these woods that had no explanation. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes on roads that twisted through the darkness like black ribbons. My headlights caught the reflective eyes of deer watching from the tree line, but nothing else moved. I parked at the Catalucci access point and shouldered my pack, checking my radio one more time. "I'm at the trailhead," I reported, starting the hike in. "Be careful, Wahali, and keep your radio on." I clicked off and started into the forest. My flashlight beam cut through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating the narrow trail ahead. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, that rich forest smell that I normally loved. But this morning it seemed heavier somehow, oppressive. I'd been walking for 20 minutes when I found the first sign. The footprint was pressed deep into the mud beside the trail, far too large to be human. I knelt down, measuring it with my hand. 18 inches long, maybe 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds. My pulse quickened. In my 5 years as a ranger, I'd seen bear tracks, elk tracks, wild boar tracks. This was none of those. The toe arrangement was wrong, too human-like, and the stride length between this print and the next one I found 15 feet ahead suggested something that walked upright. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone who worked in these mountains had. Hikers who claimed to see massive hair-covered figures moving between the trees. Campers who found their food supplies torn apart by something with incredible strength. Rangers who'd investigated strange howls that echoed through the valleys at night, sounds that weren't quite animal, but weren't quite human either. The official position was always the same: misidentification, overactive imagination, the usual suspects. But standing there in the darkness looking at that impossible footprint, I remembered something my grandfather had said during one of his stories. The Sulkalu, he'd called it. The slant-eyed giant. An ancient being from Cherokee folklore said to haunt the deep woods and steal hunters who ventured too far from their villages. He'd spoken about it matter-of-factly, the way other people talked about bears or coyotes. Just another part of the forest ecosystem, something to be respected and avoided. I took photographs of the print with my phone, though I knew the quality would be poor in the flashlight's harsh beam. Then I kept moving, following the Henderson family's last known trajectory. The forest around me remained unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my own breathing and the soft crunch of my boots on the trail. I'd been in plenty of quiet woods before. Winter mornings, the deep stillness after a snowfall. This was different. This silence felt watchful. At 6:15 a.m., just as the first gray light began filtering through the canopy, I found the campsite, or what was left of it. The tent had been shredded, long tears in the fabric that suggested massive claws or hands. Sleeping bags lay scattered across the clearing, their contents spilled into the dirt. A Coleman stove was crushed flat, as if something heavy had stepped on it, and everywhere on the tent poles, on the scattered gear, on the trees surrounding the campsite, I saw the same thing. Handprints. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own hand, pressed into the fabric and bark in what looked like dried mud. But as I examined them more closely with my flashlight, I realized the substance wasn't mud. It was darker, stickier. I touched it carefully with a gloved finger and brought it to my nose. Blood, old blood, already oxidized and darkening. Jesus, I breathed. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, this is Wahali. I found the Henderson campsite. It's bad. The tent is destroyed. Gear everywhere. No sign of the family, but there's blood. A lot of blood. Static crackled for a moment before Janet's voice came through. Are you seeing any bodies? Negative. No bodies. But there are tracks everywhere. Large tracks. I'm going to follow them. Wahali, wait for backup. Search and rescue is en route. These tracks are fresh. If the family is still alive, we might not have time to wait. I didn't wait for permission. The tracks led away from the campsite in a clear trail. The massive footprints pressed deep into the forest floor. Whatever had made them was heavy, powerful and moving with purpose. The trail wound deeper into the backcountry, away from any established paths. I followed for nearly an hour, watching the sun rise slowly over the mountains and paint the forest in shades of gold and green. The beauty of it was marred by what I was tracking, something that had attacked a family's campsite and dragged them into the wilderness. At 7:30 a.m., I heard it for the first time, a vocalization that echoed through the valley. Not a roar, not a scream, but something in between. It had a distinctly primate quality to it, a throaty whoop that rose and fell in pitch. The sound froze me in place, every hair on my body standing on end. It came from somewhere ahead, maybe a quarter-mile away. I checked my rifle, making sure a round was chambered. My grandfather's knife felt reassuring on my belt. Then I started moving again, more carefully now, trying to minimize the sound of my footsteps on the leaf litter. The tracks led me to a ravine, a deep cut in the landscape where water had carved away the rock over millennia. The bottom was thick with vegetation and fallen logs, creating natural hiding places. As I descended carefully down the slope, I saw something that made my breath catch. A shoe, small, child-sized, lying on its side near a fallen oak. I picked it up carefully. It was a pink sneaker, size 13, with cartoon characters on the side. Inside, I could see the name written in marker on the insole, Emma Henderson. They'd had a daughter. The briefing hadn't mentioned a child. "Dispatch," I said quietly into my radio. "I've found evidence of a juvenile. The family has a child with them. Copy that. Search and rescue is 15 minutes out from your last known position. They're requesting you hold and wait for..." The radio cut off mid-sentence, replaced by harsh static. I tried adjusting the frequency, but nothing came through except white noise. I looked at my phone, no signal, which was normal this deep in the backcountry. I was on my own. The vocalization came again, closer this time, and I realized something that sent a chill through my core. It sounded almost like it was answering something, like there was more than one of these creatures calling to each other through the forest. I kept Emma Henderson's shoe in my pocket and continued following the tracks. The ravine bottom grew darker as the walls rose higher on either side, blocking out the morning sun. Water trickled somewhere nearby, and the air smelled of wet stone and moss. That's when I saw the cave. It was a dark mouth in the ravine wall, partially hidden by hanging vines and fallen rocks. The tracks led directly to it, the massive footprints pressed into the mud at the entrance. From inside, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Crying. Soft, muffled sobbing. Someone was alive in there. I approached the cave entrance with my rifle raised, flashlight mounted underneath the barrel. Every instinct screamed at me to wait for backup, to follow protocol, to radio for assistance. But my radio was dead, and that crying from inside the cave was getting weaker. The entrance was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, large enough that whatever had made those tracks could enter without having to crouch. Scratch marks covered the rock walls on either side, deep gouges that looked fresh. I touched one carefully, and felt the roughness of recently disturbed stone. "Hello," I called out. "This is Park Ranger Wohali. If anyone can hear me, I'm here to help." The crying stopped abruptly. For a moment there was only silence. Then a voice, small and terrified. "Help us, please." A child's voice. "Emma." "I'm coming in," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "Are you hurt? Is your family with you?" "Mom's bleeding. Dad's not moving anymore." My throat tightened. I checked my pack one more time. First aid kit, water, emergency blanket. Then I entered the cave. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, the walls closing in until I had to turn sideways in places. My flashlight beam revealed ancient limestone formations, stalactites hanging from the ceiling like stone teeth. The air grew colder as I descended, carrying a smell that made my stomach turn, a mixture of decay, musk, and something else I couldn't identify. After about 40 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight swept across the space, revealing a nightmare. The cave was roughly 30 feet across, the ceiling lost in darkness above. The floor was covered in bones. Deer, elk, wild boar, and others I couldn't immediately identify. Some were fresh enough that scraps of flesh still clung to them. Others had been here so long they'd turned brown and brittle. And there, huddled against the far wall, were the Hendersons. The mother, Sarah Henderson, sat with her back against the rock, one arm wrapped around a small girl with tangled blonde hair. The other arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Blood soaked through her jacket from multiple lacerations across her shoulders and back. The girl, Emma, I assumed, was crying silently now, her face buried in her mother's chest. A few feet away lay a man's body. David Henderson. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. He'd been dead for hours. "I'm Ranger Wohali," I said softly, holstering my rifle and pulling out my first aid kit. "I'm going to get you out of here." Sarah's eyes focused on me with desperate hope. "There were 2 of them," she whispered. "They came at night. We heard something outside the tent, and David went to check." She broke down, unable to continue. I crossed the chamber quickly, kneeling beside her to assess her injuries. The broken arm was bad but not life-threatening. The lacerations on her back were worse. Deep tears that needed immediate attention to prevent shock from blood loss. "Where are they now?" I asked, opening my kit and pulling out gauze and antiseptic. "They left, maybe an hour ago." I heard them calling to each other, then they went out. I worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging her wounds as best I could in the dim light. Emma watched with huge traumatized eyes, occasionally glancing toward the cave entrance as if expecting the creatures to return. "Can you walk?" I asked Sarah. She nodded, though her face was pale from blood loss. "I think so. But David, I know I'm sorry. But we have to move now, while those things are gone." I helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight with one arm. Emma clung to my other hand, her grip painfully tight. We started toward the tunnel entrance, moving as quickly as Sarah's injuries would allow. We'd made it maybe 10 feet when I heard it. A sound from deeper in the cave, from a passage I hadn't noticed in my initial survey. Heavy footsteps, accompanied by that same strange whooping vocalization. "Run," I said quietly. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. Despite her injuries, she stumbled toward the exit with Emma, moving on pure adrenaline. I stayed behind, drawing my rifle and aiming at the dark passage. The creature that emerged into my flashlight beam exceeded every description I'd ever heard. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair that was matted with dirt and something else, gore from its recent kills. The face was oddly human-like, with a flat nose and deep-set eyes that caught my flashlight and reflected with an amber glow. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, suggesting immense strength, and its arms hung past its knees, ending in hands the size of dinner plates. But what froze me wasn't its size or appearance. It was the intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't a simple animal. This thing was thinking, calculating, studying me with an awareness that seemed almost human. For a moment we simply stared at each other. My finger rested on the trigger, but I didn't fire. Some instinct, maybe something passed down through my grandfather's stories, told me that shooting would be a mistake, that this creature wasn't just another animal to be driven off with violence. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A roar that seemed to vibrate through my chest, so loud in the enclosed space that I felt my teeth rattle. The smell hit me like a physical force, rotting meat and primal musk. I fired a warning shot over its head, the crack of the rifle deafening in the cave. The creature flinched back, and I seized the opportunity to run. Sarah and Emma were already in the tunnel, scrambling up the slope toward daylight. I followed, my pack bouncing against my back, the sound of pursuit echoing behind me. The creature was coming, moving through the narrow passage with surprising speed despite its size. We burst out of the cave entrance into the morning sunlight. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled them both toward the ravine slope. "Climb. Don't look back." The three of us scrambled up the rocky incline, Sarah gasping in pain with every movement. I could hear the creature behind us, emerging from the cave with a frustrated bellow. I turned and fired 2 more shots in its direction, not trying to hit it but hoping to drive it back. The shots echoed through the ravine, and for a moment, everything went still. Then from somewhere in the forest above us, I heard an answering call, that same whooping vocalization. There were more of them out there. "Keep moving," I urged, helping Sarah up the last few feet to level ground. We were back at the ravine's edge, the forest spreading out around us in all directions. I pulled out my GPS, trying to orient myself and find the fastest route back to the main trail. That's when I realized we were being herded. The creature from the cave hadn't followed us up the slope. Instead, I caught glimpses of it moving parallel to us through the trees, staying just out of clear sight. And somewhere ahead I could hear others moving through the brush, their heavy footsteps creating a loose perimeter. They were working together, coordinating, driving us in a specific direction. I changed course, pulling Sarah and Emma toward a dense thicket that would be difficult for the larger creatures to navigate. But as soon as we shifted direction, I heard movement adjusting to compensate. They anticipated the move. "What are they?" Sarah gasped, struggling to keep up. "I don't know," I admitted, "but they're intelligent, too intelligent." We pushed through the thicket, branches scraping at our clothes and skin. Emma was crying again, but she kept moving, her small legs pumping as fast as they could. I kept my rifle ready, sweeping the forest around us for any sign of attack. The trees opened up ahead, revealing a small clearing with a rocky outcropping at its center. It wasn't ideal, but it was defensible. We'd have visibility in all directions and our backs protected by stone. "There," I said, pointing. "We'll make our stand there." We'd just reached the outcropping when my radio suddenly crackled back to life. Janet's voice came through, broken and distorted. "Holly, respond. Search and rescue is your position. Can you—" "Janet, we're in the eastern backcountry. Coordinates." I checked my GPS and rattled off the numbers. 3 survivors, 1 casualty. "We're being pursued by—" The radio cut out again, dissolving into static. I positioned Sarah and Emma behind the largest rocks, creating a makeshift shelter. Then I took up a defensive position, rifle braced against the stone, scanning the tree line. They were out there. I could feel them watching, circling, waiting for something. The forest had gone completely silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Why aren't they attacking?" Sarah whispered. That was the question that terrified me most. Because if these creatures were smart enough to coordinate their movements, to herd us like prey, then they were smart enough to have a plan. And we were playing right into it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, heating the rocks we hid behind. My mouth was dry, my hands slick with sweat on the rifle stock. Emma had stopped crying, but her breathing was shallow and rapid. Early signs of shock. Then I saw it. Movement at the tree line, 50 yards away. One of the creatures stepped partially into view, its massive form unmistakable even in the dappled forest light. It stood there, watching us, making no move to attack or retreat. A second one appeared to our left, then a third to our right. We were surrounded. The creatures stood at the edge of the clearing like silent sentinels, their eyes fixed on our position, 3 of them that I could see, though I suspected there were more hidden in the forest. The largest, the one from the cave, stood directly ahead, its massive chest rising and falling with each breath. I kept my rifle aimed at the big one, my finger resting lightly on the trigger, but something held me back from firing. Maybe it was the memory of my grandfather's stories, the old laws he'd spoken about regarding the creatures of the deep forest. Maybe it was the intelligence I saw in those eyes, a recognition that killing one might doom us all. "Well, Holly." Sarah's voice was weak. "What do we do?" Before I could answer, the large creature moved. Not toward us but to the side, revealing something I hadn't noticed before, a smaller figure, also covered in dark hair but shorter, maybe 6 feet tall, younger. The juvenile Bigfoot looked between the adult and our position, and I understood with sudden clarity what was happening. This wasn't a hunting party, this was a family unit. My mind raced back to the destroyed campsite, the violence of the attack. David Henderson must have done something when the creatures appeared, grabbed a weapon, made a threatening gesture, and the adults had responded to protect their young, just as any parent would. We'd stumbled into their territory, set up our tent near their den. The Hendersons hadn't known, couldn't have known, but ignorance didn't matter to creatures defending their home. I slowly lowered my rifle, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. Sarah gasped beside me. "What are you doing?" "Trust me." I set the rifle on the rock but kept it within reach. Then I did something that felt insane even as I was doing it. I stood up, making myself visible and vulnerable. The creatures tensed, the big one taking a half step forward. But I held up my hands, palms out, in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. I thought about my grandfather, about the stories he'd told, about the respect his people had always shown to the forest and its inhabitants. "Tukalu," I said, using the Cherokee name. My voice sounded small in the clearing. "We mean no harm. We're leaving your territory. We won't come back." The large creature tilted its head, studying me with those unsettling amber eyes. For a long moment nothing happened. Then it made a sound. Not the aggressive roar from before, but something softer, almost questioning. I took a step forward, still with my hands raised. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab the rifle, to protect Sarah and Emma. But I forced myself to stand still, to show no fear. The creature watched me approach, its massive muscles tensing. When I was 20 feet away, it made a low rumbling sound, and I stopped. This was as close as it would allow. From my pocket I slowly pulled out Emma's shoe, the one I'd found at the ravine. I held it up, making sure the creature could see it, then carefully placed it on the ground between us. Then I backed away, returning to Sarah and Emma's position. The large creature moved forward, each step making the ground tremble slightly. It picked up the shoe with surprising delicacy, held it for a moment, then set it back down. "For Machar." Its eyes met mine again, and I saw something there that looked almost like understanding. It turned and made a series of vocalizations, barks and whoops that seemed directed at the other creatures surrounding us. One by one, they melted back into the forest, their forms disappearing among the trees with barely a sound. The large one remained for a moment longer. It looked at David Henderson's body, which I'd dragged from the cave and covered with my emergency blanket. Something like regret crossed its face, or maybe I was projecting human emotions onto something fundamentally alien. Then it too vanished into the forest, leaving us alone in the clearing. The silence that followed felt different from before. The forest slowly came back to life. Birds began singing. Insects resumed their buzzing. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on us lifted. "Did that really just happen?" Sarah whispered. "I think so." My hands were shaking as I picked up my rifle. "We need to move, now, while they're giving us the chance." I helped Sarah to her feet, and Emma wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. We started walking, heading northeast toward where I hoped we'd intersect with search and rescue. I kept checking over my shoulder, but I saw no sign of pursuit. My radio crackled to life again, Janet's voice clear this time. "Well, Holly, we have your position. Search and rescue is inbound. ETA 10 minutes. Do you copy?" "I copy." Relief flooded through me. "We have 2 survivors, 1 KIA. The threat has dispersed, but tell the teams to approach with caution." "Copy that." "Medical is standing by." "What about the—" "Later," I cut her off. "I'll explain everything later." We walked for 15 minutes before I heard the blessed sound of a helicopter overhead. It circled once, then I saw search and rescue personnel emerging from the tree line ahead, their bright orange vests visible through the forest. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical attention, debriefing, and evacuation. Sarah and Emma were airlifted to the nearest hospital. David Henderson's body was recovered and transported with solemn efficiency. I gave my report to the search and rescue coordinator, carefully editing out the more unbelievable details. But that night, back at my ranger station, I sat down and wrote everything. Every detail, every impossible moment. I didn't submit it as an official report that would have been career suicide. Instead, I locked it in my desk drawer. Another story that would never see the light of day. My phone buzzed. A text from Janet. "The Hendersons are stable. Emma is asking for you. She wants to say thank you." I stared at the message for a long moment. A little girl who'd watched her father die, who'd been dragged to a cave by creatures that shouldn't exist, who'd somehow survived. She wanted to thank me. But all I could think about was the look in that creature's eyes. The intelligence there, the calculation, the family unit protecting their territory. They're young. Were they so different from us? I opened my grandfather's journal, the one he'd given me before he died. It was filled with stories, observations, wisdom passed down through generations. I flipped to a page I'd marked years ago, reading his careful handwriting. "The Sulkalu are ancient, older than our oldest stories. They keep to themselves, harm no one who respects their space. But the world is getting smaller, and their territory shrinks every year. One day there will be no forest deep enough for them to hide. What happens then? What happens then?" Indeed. I closed the journal and looked out my window at the dark forest beyond. Somewhere out there, a family of creatures that science said couldn't exist was settling down for the night, caring for their young, mourning their territory's violation. Tomorrow I'd have to write my official report. I'd mention a bear attack, the standard explanation. The physical evidence could support it if you didn't look too closely at the footprints, the hand marks, the coordinated nature of the assault. But I knew the truth. And I suspected I wasn't the only ranger who did. My radio crackled. "All units, be advised. We have another missing hiker report. Solo male, last seen near Klingman's Dome. Disappeared approximately 2 hours ago. All available personnel are requested to—" I was already reaching for my pack before the transmission finished. 2 weeks later, I sat in a cramped conference room at park headquarters staring at a map covered in red pins. Each pin represented a missing person case over the past 5 years. The pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for. Deputy Chief Martinez stood at the head of the table, his expression grim. "Well, Holly, you're our most experienced backcountry ranger. I need your honest assessment. Are we looking at a predator problem?" Around the table sat 3 other senior rangers, a representative from the National Park Service and a wildlife biologist from the University of Tennessee. They all looked at me expectantly. I thought carefully about my answer. The official story about the Henderson incident was already set. A tragic encounter with a territorial black bear, complicated by poor campsite selection and improper food storage. Sarah and Emma Henderson had corroborated this version, whether because they truly believed it or because the alternative was too frightening to acknowledge. But sitting in my desk drawer back at the station was my real account. And in my grandfather's journal were dozens of similar stories spanning decades. "I think," I said slowly, "that we're dealing with something that's always been here. Something that's being displaced by increased human activity in the backcountry." The biologist, Dr. Reeves, leaned forward. "You mean bears, I assume? Because there's been a documented increase in human-bear interactions correlating with—" "No," I met her eyes. "Not bears." The room went silent. Martinez's jaw tightened. "Ranger Woody, are you seriously suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we need to establish exclusion zones in certain areas of the park. Deep backcountry regions that we close to public access, permanently." "That's not feasible," the NPS representative said. The public has a right to be safe." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared, distributing copies around the table. "These are incident reports going back 30 years. Notice the pattern. They cluster in specific regions, the same regions where we consistently find evidence of unexplained large primate activity. Dr. Reeves studied the documents, her expression skeptical. Large primate activity. In North America, the indigenous peoples of this region have stories about forest giants going back centuries, I said. My own grandfather documented sightings and encounters. What if they weren't just stories? Martinez rubbed his temples. Wohali, I know you've been through a traumatic experience. The Henderson incident was, this isn't about trauma, sir. It's about pattern recognition. Look at the data objectively. The footprints we can't explain. The vocalizations that don't match any known species. The coordinated behavior suggesting intelligence beyond typical wildlife. You're describing Bigfoot, one of the other rangers said flatly. You're asking us to make policy decisions based on Bigfoot. I'm asking us to acknowledge that there are things in these mountains we don't fully understand, and that instead of dismissing them or covering them up, we should be protecting both the creatures and the people who might encounter them. Dr. Reeves set down the documents, her expression thoughtful. There have been some interesting primatology studies suggesting possible remnant populations of Gigantopithecus in remote Asian forests. If a similar species survived in the isolated mountains of North America. You can't be serious, the NPS representative said. I'm saying, Dr. Reeves continued, that science has a history of dismissing indigenous knowledge, only to later confirm it was accurate. If Native American tribes across this entire region have consistent stories about these beings, maybe we should at least investigate properly. Martinez looked around the table, gauging reactions. Even if, and this is a massive if, even if such creatures existed, how would we handle it? We can't announce to the world that Bigfoot is real. The park would be overrun with hunters and researchers within days. We don't announce it, I said. We establish the exclusion zones under the guise of endangered species habitat protection. We increase ranger patrols in buffer areas. We educate visitors about avoiding certain regions without explaining why. And we document everything properly, in case we ever do need to go public. The meeting lasted another hour, with arguments for and against various proposals. In the end, Martinez agreed to a pilot program, 3 small exclusion zones in the deepest backcountry, officially designated as critical wildlife habitat. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was a start. As the meeting broke up, Dr. Reeves approached me. That report you mentioned, your grandfather's documentation, I'd be very interested in seeing it. I hesitated. The journal represented generations of family knowledge, passed down through a culture that had learned to coexist with these creatures. Sharing it with the scientific community felt like a betrayal of that trust. I need to think about it, I said. She handed me her card. I understand, but consider this. Proper scientific documentation might be the only way to ensure these creatures' long-term survival. Right now, they're cryptids, folklore. The moment they're proven to exist, they'll need protection under endangered species laws. Otherwise, they'll be hunted to extinction within a generation. She left me with that thought. That evening, I drove back to my station as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My phone rang, Sarah Henderson. Wohali, I hope it's okay that I'm calling. The hospital gave me your number. Of course. How are you and Emma doing? Better. Physically, anyway. The doctors say I'll regain full use of my arm with physical therapy. She's having nightmares. They recommended a child psychologist. That's good. She's been through something no child should experience. A long pause. Wohali, I need to know something. What we saw in those woods. The official report says it was a bear, but Emma keeps drawing pictures of something else. Something that walked like a man but wasn't human. I keep telling her it was just a bear, that her memory is confused by the trauma. But you know what you saw. I finished quietly. Yes, her voice broke. And I don't know what to do with that knowledge. How do I explain to my daughter that monsters are real, that they killed her father, that the world isn't safe the way we always told her it was? I thought about my own childhood, listening to my grandfather's stories, how he'd taught me to respect the forest, to recognize that humans weren't the only intelligent beings on this planet, how that knowledge had shaped everything I became. You tell her the truth, I said. That there are things in this world we don't fully understand, that the forest has its own inhabitants who were here long before us, and that what happened to your family was a tragedy, but it wasn't evil, it was a clash between 2 different worlds. Will that help her sleep at night? Maybe not right away. But it's better than telling her comfortable lies. She deserves to understand what really happened. After we hung up, I opened my grandfather's journal again. He'd written an entry near the end, dated just a few weeks before he died. I've spent my whole life studying the Tsilkalu, documenting their existence, trying to understand them. But I've come to realize that understanding isn't the same as control. They are what they are, ancient, intelligent, fundamentally other. The real question isn't whether they exist, but whether we can share this world with them. And I fear the answer is becoming no. Not because they're dangerous, but because we can't seem to leave any wilderness untouched, any mystery unexplored, any territory unclaimed. My radio crackled. "Wahali, you there? We've got a situation." I recognized the voice. Marcus, one of the younger rangers. "I'm here. What's going on?" "I'm at Elkmont Campground. Some hikers just came in claiming they saw something near the river. Something big and hairy that walked upright. They've got video on their phone." My stomach tightened. "Don't let them leave. I'm on my way. I'm on my way." I grabbed my keys and headed out into the night. As I drove toward Elkmont, I thought about what Dr. Reeves had said. Maybe it was time to stop hiding the truth. Maybe documentation and scientific protection were the only way forward. Or maybe the moment we tried to study these creatures, to catalog and control them, we'd lose something essential. The mystery that had kept them safe for thousands of years would evaporate, replaced by research stations and observation blinds, and eventually, inevitably, cages. I didn't have the answer. All I knew was that I'd spent my entire adult life serving as a bridge between two worlds, the modern one that wanted everything explained and controlled, and the ancient one that respected mystery and maintained boundaries. When I arrived at Elkmont, I found Marcus standing with a family of 4, parents and 2 teenage kids. The father was excitedly scrolling through his phone. "Right here," he said, showing me the screen. "We got it on video, clear as day." I watched the shaky footage. In the gathering dusk, near the river's edge, a large dark figure moved between the trees. It was only visible for a few seconds before disappearing into the shadows, but the gait was unmistakable. Bipedal, powerful, not quite human. "That's incredible," I said carefully. "May I ask you to do something for me?" "Sure, anything. Don't post that online, not yet." The father's expression shifted from excited to suspicious. "Why not? This is proof. This could change everything." "It could," I agreed. "But these creatures, whatever they are, they've survived by remaining hidden. The moment that video goes viral, this entire forest will be flooded with hunters, researchers, curiosity seekers. Is that really what you want? To be responsible for destroying the last refuge of an undiscovered species?" The mother touched her husband's arm. "He has a point, Steve. Remember what happened with those owl nests we found last year? We posted the location online, and within days, people had disturbed the site so much the birds abandoned it." The father looked at his phone, then back at me. "So what are you asking?" "I'm asking you to think about it. Keep the video private for now. Let me share it with some researchers who might be able to help us understand what we're dealing with. And in return, I promise you'll be part of whatever comes next." The discovery of the century, but done responsibly. He thought about it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but I want to be kept in the loop. Regular updates." "You have my word." After they left, Marcus and I stood in the parking lot. "You really think it's possible?" he asked. "That Bigfoot is real?" "I think," I said, "that the word real might not be adequate for what we're dealing with. But yes, I think there are creatures in these mountains that science hasn't cataloged yet. And I think our job is to protect them just like we protect the bears and elk and everything else, even if they're dangerous." I thought about the creature in the cave, the intelligence in its eyes, the moment of understanding between us. Everything in nature is dangerous when threatened or protecting its family. That doesn't make it evil, it makes it alive. I drove back to my station as midnight approached, my mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. The video would change things. I knew that much. Even keeping it private, word would spread. Other researchers would get involved. Eventually, inevitably, the truth would come out. My grandfather's journal sat on the passenger seat. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, looking out at the dark forest stretched below. Somewhere in those trees, families of creatures were living their lives, following patterns older than human civilization. I opened the journal to the last page where my grandfather had written his final entry. "To whoever reads this after I'm gone, these mountains hold secrets that should remain secret. Not because the truth is dangerous, but because some mysteries are meant to be respected, not solved. If you choose to reveal what I've documented here, do it for the right reasons. Do it to protect, not to exploit. Do it to preserve, not to profit. And remember, they were here first. We are the intruders in their world, not the other way around. Whatever you decide, walk softly in these woods. And listen for the silence. That's when they're watching." I closed the journal and looked out at the darkness. Tomorrow, I'd call Dr. Reeves. We'd start the documentation process, build the case for protection, maybe even prepare for the day when the world would have to acknowledge what lived in these mountains. But tonight, I just sat and listened to the forest, listening for that special silence, wondering if somewhere out there they were listening too, and hoping that whatever came next, we'd find a way to share this world without destroying each other in the process. I never should have ignored the warnings about Sultua Point. The memory of that day in 2008 still haunts me, clinging to my thoughts like the thick morning fog that blanketed Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was 34 then, working forestry with a state contract to map endangered plant species across the region. My name's Clyde Red Bear, Apache on my father's side, Chippewa on my mother's. Mom always said I inherited Dad's stubborn streak, which probably explains why I disregarded every story, every warning I'd ever heard about those woods. Most days my job was solitary and predictable. I'd hike for miles documenting soil patterns and vegetation, rarely encountering anyone else. The isolation suited me. I'd developed a reputation as reliable but not particularly sociable, the kind of guy who got the job done without unnecessary conversation. That particular Tuesday in late September started differently. My supervisor called the night before informing me I'd be paired with an intern named Marcus for the Sultua Point expedition. Kid's eager, studying conservation biology at Northern Michigan University. Show him the ropes, will you? He could use the field experience. I grunted an affirmative, not thrilled about having company, but not bothered enough to argue. When I pulled my weathered Ford Ranger into the forestry department parking lot the next morning, I spotted him immediately. Tall, lanky, early 20s with an expensive-looking backpack and boots that hadn't seen enough trail to develop proper creases. Marcus Walsh, he introduced himself, extending his hand with an enthusiastic grip. Really appreciate you taking me along, Mr. Red Bear. I've read your reports on the native medicinal plants in the region. Fascinating methodology. His enthusiasm was unexpected. Most interns barely knew my name, let alone my work. Just Clyde, I corrected, loading my gear into the truck. We're heading to Sultua Point. It's about an hour's drive, then we'll be on foot most of the day. Marcus nodded eagerly, climbing into the passenger seat. As we pulled away, he launched into a detailed monologue about his thesis project on conservation economics. The kid was smart, no question, but my God, could he talk. For the entire drive, he barely paused for breath, shifting from academic theories to personal anecdotes to questions about my experience. I answered in brief sentences when required, focusing on the winding road ahead. The first hint of unease came when I turned onto the unmarked dirt road leading to our starting point. Marcus suddenly went quiet. I glanced over and found him staring at the dense pines lining the route, his expression unreadable. Something wrong, I asked. He shook his head slightly. Just, my grandmother used to tell stories about this area. She was Ojibwe, said there were places in these woods where the boundary between worlds gets thin. I grunted non-committally. Every tribe had their legends about forbidden places. My mother had her share of stories too. Warnings passed down through generations about territories where certain spirits dwelled. But I'd been working these forests for 15 years without incident. Respect the land, move with purpose, and nature generally left you alone. That was my philosophy. We parked at the trailhead, a barely visible opening in the thick forest marked only by a faded wooden post. The morning was unusually still. No breeze disturbed the treetops. No birds called from the branches. Just the heavy silence of ancient woods. We'll follow this trail about 3 miles in, I explained, shouldering my pack. There's a section near the old creek bed where several endangered orchid species have been reported. Our job is to document their distribution and take soil samples. Marcus nodded, checking his GPS unit. Lead the way. The trail was overgrown, clearly unused for months or possibly years. The further we ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. Tall pines gave way to ancient oaks and maples, their branches forming a canopy so dense that by mid-morning it felt like dusk beneath them. Marcus had resumed his chatter, but even his voice seemed muffled by the heaviness of the air. He was cataloging plants we passed, reciting Latin names and ecological significance with impressive accuracy. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated his knowledge. By noon, we'd covered about 2 miles, stopping occasionally to document plant specimens. I was focused on a patch of ferns when Marcus called out from several yards ahead. Clyde, you need to see this. Something in his tone made me straighten immediately. Gone was the enthusiastic student. His voice now held a note of confusion, maybe even alarm. I made my way to where he stood, kneeling beside what looked like disturbed earth. What do you make of this? He asked, gesturing to the ground before him. I crouched down, studying the marks carefully. Something had gouged deep furrows into the soil. 4 parallel lines about 8 inches apart, too methodical for random animal activity. They weren't bear tracks, too narrow for that. Not wolf, not moose, not anything I recognized from 15 years in these woods. Could be. I started, then stopped myself. In truth, I had no explanation. Marcus snapped a few photos with his digital camera. It's weird, right? Almost like something was dragged through here, but the pattern is too regular. I nodded, unable to shake the growing sensation of being watched. The forest remained eerily silent around us, as if holding its breath. A cloud passed overhead, momentarily dimming the filtered light that reached the forest floor. "Let's keep moving," I said, standing and adjusting my pack. "We still have ground to cover before heading back." As we continued deeper into the woods, neither of us mentioned the strange markings again, but I noticed Marcus had stopped talking, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by watchful silence. He stayed closer to me now, no longer wandering ahead to examine plants that caught his interest. The air grew colder as we walked, unusually so for September. I checked my watch just past 1 p.m., yet it felt like late evening beneath the increasingly dense canopy. Shadows seemed to stretch in impossible directions, playing tricks on my peripheral vision. "Do you feel that?" Marcus whispered suddenly, stopping in his tracks. I paused, sensing what he meant before he elaborated. There was a subtle vibration in the ground, almost imperceptible but definitely there, like something large moving in the distance. "Probably just logging equipment on the other side of the ridge," I said, not believing it myself. The nearest active logging site was miles away. Marcus looked unconvinced, but nodded. "Yeah, probably." We pressed on, the trail narrowing until it was barely discernible from the surrounding undergrowth. The trees grew more twisted here, their bark darker, with strange patterns that reminded me of the warnings my mother used to whisper about marked places, boundaries where the old spirits claimed dominion. For the first time in my career, I considered turning back. Something about these woods felt wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. But professional pride kept me moving forward. We had a job to do, data to collect. Besides, what would I tell my supervisor? That the forest gave me the creeps. So we continued deeper into Sultua Point, unaware that with each step we were crossing into territory where no amount of scientific training or rational thinking would save us from what waited ahead. By early afternoon, the forest had transformed around us. What started as typical Upper Peninsula woodland had subtly shifted into something older, primeval. The trees stood further apart here, their trunks massive and gnarled, covered in lichen patterns I'd never seen in all my years of fieldwork. The air felt dense, almost resistant to our movement, like walking through invisible cobwebs. Marcus had fallen completely silent, his earlier enthusiasm thoroughly dampened. I caught him glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, his hand tightening around the strap of his backpack. "You hearing something?" I asked, pausing to listen. He shook his head, then hesitated. "Not hearing, feeling, like something's off." I knew what he meant. The forest had gone beyond quiet. It felt abandoned, as if every living creature had fled hours ago, leaving just the two of us trespassing in an empty sanctuary. Even the insects had gone silent, no buzz of mosquitoes or flies despite the damp conditions. We continued walking, our footsteps the only sound in the oppressive stillness. The GPS unit occasionally lost signal, forcing us to rely on my compass and map. According to my calculations, we were approaching the creek bed where the rare orchids had been reported. But the landscape didn't match my expectations. "This can't be right," I muttered, checking the map again. "The creek should be just ahead, but the topography is all wrong." Marcus pointed to a depression about 50 yards ahead. "Maybe it's dried up." "It's been a dry summer." I frowned. The creek was spring-fed, documented consistently for decades. It shouldn't have changed course or dried up completely. But as we approached the depression, I realized it wasn't a creek bed at all. It was a long, winding trench, about 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, with smooth sides that looked almost polished. "What could have made this?" Marcus asked, kneeling at the edge. I shook my head, studying the formation. Nothing natural. The walls of the trench were too uniform, too precisely carved into the forest floor. Maybe old mining activity. Even as I suggested it, I knew it was wrong. The Upper Peninsula had its share of abandoned mines, but nothing was documented in this specific area. Besides, this didn't resemble any mining operation I'd ever seen. Marcus reached down, running his fingers along the inner wall of the trench. "It's warm," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "The soil is warm to the touch." I crouched beside him, confirming his observation. Despite the cool autumn air, the walls of the trench radiated heat like they'd been baking in summer sun. But here, beneath the dense canopy where direct sunlight barely penetrated, such warmth was impossible. "Let's take some samples," I suggested, pulling collection vials from my pack. If nothing else, the soil composition might provide some answers later. As Marcus helped collect samples, I noticed more unusual features in our surroundings. The vegetation near the trench showed signs of stress, leaves curled and browned at the edges despite recent rainfall in the region. The ground felt unusually soft underfoot, almost spongy, as if something had altered its composition.
"Look at this," Marcus called, pointing to a patch of soil about 10 feet from the trench.
I moved closer, immediately recognizing what had caught his attention. More of those strange gouges, but fresher this time, the soil still crumbling at the edges, and beside them, a distinct footprint, if you could call it that. It resembled no animal track I'd ever encountered, roughly triangular with what appeared to be 3 pointed digits extending forward and one backward, each leaving a deep impression in the soft earth. Some kind of bird? Marcus suggested weakly. I shook my head. The print was massive, at least 15 inches long. No bird makes tracks like this. And look at the depth. Whatever left this was heavy. I took photographs and measurements, trying to maintain a scientific detachment even as my instincts screamed that we were facing something outside my expertise. Native stories from my childhood flooded back. Tales of forest guardians and territorial spirits that took physical form when their domains were violated. We should mark this location and report it, I said, fighting to keep my voice neutral. Might be evidence of an undocumented species. Marcus looked skeptical. An undocumented bipedal species in Michigan. That's unlikely. I didn't say it was bipedal, I pointed out. The arrangement could indicate an unusual gait pattern in a known quadruped. Even as I offered the rational explanation, we both knew it was inadequate. The prints didn't match any quadruped native to the region, and the depth suggested something far heavier than any documented wildlife. We continued our survey, finding more trenches intersecting at odd angles throughout the area, creating a complex network beneath the forest floor. Near one junction, we discovered a pile of organic matter, decomposing plant material mixed with what looked disturbingly like fur and small bones. Owl pellets? Marcus suggested, poking at the substance with a stick. Too large, I replied. And owls don't create middens like this. As we examined the area, I noticed more unusual features: trees with bark stripped in spiral patterns, rocks arranged in configurations that seemed too deliberate to be natural, patches of ground where nothing grew, forming perfect circles in the otherwise lush forest floor. The deeper we ventured, the more the anomalies accumulated. I maintained meticulous notes and photographs, clinging to scientific procedure even as my unease grew. Marcus had stopped offering explanations, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by vigilant silence. By mid-afternoon, we reached a section of forest where the canopy opened slightly, allowing shafts of sunlight to penetrate to the ground. In this improved light, I noticed something disturbing about the trees surrounding us. Many had what appeared to be deep gouges in their trunks, ranging from ground level to heights of 12 or 15 feet. The marks were similar to bear scratches but far deeper and more systematic, often creating geometric patterns across multiple trees. Bears marking territory? Marcus asked, tracing one gouge with his fingertips. Bears don't create patterns, I said, studying the markings. And these cuts are too clean. Look at the edges, almost like they were made with a tool. As if on cue, a distant sound echoed through the trees. A low resonant scraping that raised the hair on my arms. It lasted only seconds but seemed to come from all directions at once. Marcus froze. What was that? I remained still, listening intently. Could be a tree falling against another. But we both knew it wasn't. The sound had a deliberate quality, almost rhythmic, like something large dragging across a hard surface. Maybe we should head back, Marcus suggested, checking his watch. It'll be getting dark in a few hours. Under normal circumstances, I would have pressed on. Our survey was incomplete and we'd barely collected half the data we came for. But nothing about these woods felt normal anymore. Yeah, I agreed, surprising myself. Let's circle back, follow a different route to the trailhead. Relief flashed across Marcus's face.
Good plan.
As we consulted the map to plot our return course, that scraping sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable in the stillness. We both looked up, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched had intensified, prickling between my shoulder blades. Let's move, I said quietly, pocketing the map. We began heading west, aiming to intersect with the main trail about a mile south of our current position. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, deadfalls blocking our path, undergrowth becoming denser and more tangled. It was as if the forest itself was trying to slow our progress. The scraping sound followed us, always just distant enough that we couldn't identify its source, but persistent. Sometimes it came from ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes from both directions simultaneously. Logic told me it was an acoustic trick, sound waves bouncing off trees and rocks, but it felt purposeful, coordinated. As we navigated a particularly dense thicket, Marcus suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing silently ahead. Through a gap in the foliage about 30 yards distant, something moved, a dark shape, substantial but indistinct, sliding between tree trunks with an unnatural fluidity. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, squinting to catch another glimpse, but whatever it was had vanished. "Probably a bear," I said, not believing it myself. It was standing upright. The statement hung between us, neither of us willing to explore its implications. We adjusted our course slightly, giving the area a wide berth. The sounds continued intermittently, sometimes accompanied by a deeper vibration that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. With each passing minute, the forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath becoming visible in the cooling air. According to my watch, it was only 4 p.m., but it felt like evening was closing in rapidly. We increased our pace, pushing through the underbrush with growing urgency. My mental map of the area had become unreliable, landmarks didn't match my expectations, distances seemed compressed or expanded unpredictably. Even the compass behaved erratically, the needle swinging wildly before settling in directions that contradicted my instinctual sense of orientation. "I think we're lost," Marcus finally said, stating what I'd been reluctant to admit. "Not lost," I countered, "just temporarily disoriented. The trail has to be west of us." But west had become a meaningless concept in these woods. The sun was now completely obscured by clouds, and the forest had taken on a uniform dimness that erased shadows and depth perception. We pushed on, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound between the massive trees. The scraping sounds had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that felt even more threatening. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, calculating. As we rounded a bend in the trail, Marcus suddenly stopped, his body tensing. "Clyde," he whispered, pointing ahead. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. About 50 yards ahead, the trees opened into what appeared to be a clearing, but what drew our attention was what surrounded it. Arranged in a perfect circle around the perimeter, spaced at regular intervals, were what looked like cairns, stacks of stones and other materials rising from the forest floor. But as we drew closer, I realized with growing horror that they weren't just stones. They were bones. Countless bones of various sizes, meticulously stacked and arranged into tower-like structures that rose 8 or 9 feet from the ground. Some appeared to be animal remains, deer antlers, wolf skulls, the curved ribs of large mammals, but others were unmistakably human. Femurs, pelvic bones, craniums with empty eye sockets staring outward from these macabre monuments. "Jesus," Marcus breathed, then caught himself. I couldn't respond, my throat constricting as I took in the scale of the ossuary before us. There were dozens of these bone towers, each seemingly arranged according to some incomprehensible pattern. And at the center of the clearing stood something else, a structure different from the others, larger and more complex. "We need to leave," I said, finding my voice at last. "Now." But even as I spoke, that scraping sound returned louder, closer, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. Marcus and I exchanged a single glance, understanding passing between us without words. We turned and began retracing our steps, moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the undergrowth. Behind us, something emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. I caught only a glimpse, a dark shape, massive and distorted, moving with a terrible, purposeful grace toward the central structure. I didn't look back again, focusing solely on the path ahead and the increasingly desperate need to find our way out of these haunted woods before nightfall. The afternoon had descended into a premature twilight by the time we'd put a quarter-mile between ourselves and that horrific bone-lined clearing. My heart hammered against my ribs as we pushed through the underbrush, no longer concerned with stealth, focused only on distance. Marcus stayed close behind me, his breathing ragged and panicked. "What the hell did we just see?" he gasped when we finally paused, sheltering in the shadow of a massive fallen oak. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent response. Nothing in my 15 years of forestry work had prepared me for the grotesque display we'd witnessed. Those weren't hunting trophies, or the random accumulation of scavenger kills. They were deliberate constructions, monuments built with methodical precision. "We need to contact the authorities," Marcus continued, his voice cracking. "Those were human remains back there. This could be some kind of serial killer dumping ground." The rational explanation should have been comforting, but we both knew it fell short. No killer, no matter how deranged, could account for the scale of what we'd seen, or the impossible arrangement of those bone structures, some balanced in configurations that defied physics. "First, we focus on getting out," I said, checking my compass again. The needle continued its erratic spinning, rendering it useless. We follow the declining slope. Water flows downhill, and the creek feeds into the main river. If we find water, we find our way out. Marcus nodded, clinging to this practical plan. We set off again, moving as quickly as the dense undergrowth allowed. The forest had changed again, the massive ancient trees giving way to younger, closely packed pines that clawed at our clothing and scratched our exposed skin. The ground beneath our feet had become increasingly soft and damp, suggesting we were indeed moving toward lower elevation. That's when we heard it again, that wet, dragging sound, now accompanied by a deep rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It came from behind us, moving parallel to our course but staying just out of sight among the trees. "It's following us," Marcus whispered, his face pale in the fading light. "Keep moving," I urged, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Don't look back." We increased our pace, nearly jogging now despite the treacherous footing. The sounds pursued us, sometimes falling behind, sometimes circling ahead, as if our tracker was toying with us, herding us in a specific direction. I realized with growing dread that we might be walking into a trap, but the alternative, stopping or changing course, seemed equally dangerous. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we stumbled upon what I first took to be salvation, a small wooden structure nestled among the trees ahead. As we drew closer, I recognized it as an old trapper's cabin, weathered and apparently abandoned, but still standing. Thank God, Marcus breathed. Maybe there's a radio, or supplies, or... Wait, I cautioned, studying the cabin with growing unease. Something about it felt wrong, the angle of the roof slightly off, the proportions subtly distorted, and surrounding it, barely visible in the gathering gloom, were more of those strange gouges in the earth forming concentric circles around the structure. But we had little choice. The sky had darkened to deep purple, and genuine night would fall within minutes. Whatever was tracking us through the woods, I had no desire to face it in darkness. We'll check it out, I decided, but stay alert. We approached cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt, a woefully inadequate weapon against whatever had constructed those bone towers, but better than nothing. The cabin's single window was dark, its glass long since shattered. The wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a high-pitched whine that seemed obscenely loud in the forest silence. The interior was a single room, dark and musty. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, and the beam revealed Spartan furnishings: a rusted metal cot against one wall, a small table with one broken leg, a cast-iron stove blackened with decades of use. Check for anything useful, I instructed, moving to the windows to secure them as best I could. Marcus swept his light across the room, stopping suddenly on the far wall. Clyde, he called, his voice tight. You need to see this. I turned, following his beam to where it illuminated the rough-hewn logs of the back wall. Carved into the wood, covering nearly the entire surface, were symbols, hundreds of them, overlapping and interconnected. Some resembled letters from alphabets I couldn't identify. Others were pictographs depicting crude humanoid figures with elongated limbs and misshapen heads. But most disturbing were the larger designs that incorporated these symbols into sprawling mandalas of incomprehensible complexity. What is it? Marcus asked, his light tracing the patterns. Some kind of code? I shook my head slowly. Some of the symbols tugged at my memory. Similar to, but distinct from, petroglyphs I'd seen on Anishinaabe territories. These carried a different energy. The lines cut deeper and more frantic, as if carved in desperate haste or manic fervor. I don't know, I admitted, but I don't think this cabin belonged to a trapper. Marcus continued examining the wall, his academic curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. The patterns seemed to radiate from this central figure, he noted, pointing to a large symbol that resembled an inverted tree with writhing roots extending upward instead of branches. Almost like a map, or a... He never finished the sentence. Outside, perhaps 20 yards from the cabin, something heavy moved through the underbrush branches, snapping, earth compressing under substantial weight. We both froze, listening as the sounds circled the clearing, methodical and unhurried. Kill the light, I whispered. Marcus switched off his flashlight, plunging us into near-total darkness. Only the faintest gray illumination filtered through the broken window, barely enough to make out each other's silhouettes. We stood motionless, hardly daring to breathe, as the sounds outside grew closer, then stopped directly in front of the cabin door. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, pregnant with malevolent anticipation. I could feel Marcus trembling beside me, hear the shallow, rapid pattern of his breathing. My own heart pounded so violently I was certain it must be audible outside. Then came a new sound, a low, wet clicking. That might have been laughter if filtered through a throat never meant for human speech. It rose and fell in a deliberate rhythm, almost musical in its obscene cadence. Something scraped against the outer wall, testing the structure's integrity. The door, I mouthed silently to Marcus, gesturing toward the entrance. It had no lock, no bar, nothing to prevent whatever lurked outside from entering. Understanding immediately, Marcus moved with me toward the door. We pressed our shoulders against it, bracing our feet against the uneven floorboards. The wood felt thin and insubstantial beneath my palms, hardly a barrier at all. Outside, the clicking stopped. For several heartbeats, there was only silence, heavy with expectation. Then the door bulged inward with terrific force, nearly throwing us off our feet. We pushed back, straining against the pressure. Wood splintered along the frame as another impact threatened to tear the door from its hinges. The table, I hissed. Wedge it against the door. Marcus scrambled for the broken table, dragging it across the floor. Together we tilted it against the door, bracing its legs against the opposite wall to create a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't hold against determined assault, but it might buy us precious minutes. No sooner had we secured the table than something struck the cabin's side wall with such force that the entire structure shuddered. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling as the assault continued, moving methodically around the perimeter, testing for weaknesses. "There must be another way out," Marcus whispered desperately, scanning the cabin's interior. I spotted a small trapdoor in the ceiling, likely access to a storage loft. "There," I pointed. "Give me a boost." Marcus made a stirrup with his hands, lifting me toward the ceiling. I pushed against the trapdoor, relieved when it gave way with minimal resistance. Pulling myself up, I found a small storage space beneath the peaked roof, empty save for a few moldering burlap sacks. Most importantly, part of the roof had collapsed, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. "Come on," I called down softly, extending my arm to pull Marcus up. He had just grasped my hand when the cabin's back wall exploded inward, showering the room with splintered wood and debris. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something massive filling the newly created breach, a shape of impossible proportions, its outline seeming to warp and shift even as I stared at it. 2 points of cold luminescence glowed where eyes should be, fixing on us with predatory intensity. Marcus screamed, a sound of pure animal terror that cut through the night. His grip on my hand tightened convulsively as I strained to pull him up, but something had seized his legs, dragging him backward with inexorable strength. I braced myself against the trapdoor frame, pulling with all my might, feeling the tendons in my shoulder threaten to tear from the effort. For one horrible moment we were suspended in equilibrium. Marcus stretched between my desperate grip and the unseen force below. Then his hand slipped from mine, slick with sweat and terror, and he fell back into the darkness of the cabin. His scream transformed into something worse, a bubbling liquid sound abruptly cut short. Instinct took over. I scrambled through the roof opening, heedless of the jagged edges that tore at my clothing and skin, emerging onto the sloped roof and sliding down to drop into the clearing beyond. The night air hit my lungs like ice water, shocking me into motion. I ran blindly into the forest, pursued by sounds no human throat could produce, a symphony of clicks, hisses, and that terrible wet laughter echoing through the trees. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst, stumbling through underbrush and crashing into low-hanging branches that lashed my face and tore at my eyes. Behind me, always behind me, came that dragging sound, patient, relentless, drawing incrementally closer with each passing minute. Eventually I collapsed at the base of a massive pine, physically incapable of moving further. Blood trickled from dozens of scratches across my face and hands. My ankle throbbed where I'd twisted it in a hidden root hole. Leaning against the rough bark, I strained to hear any sounds of pursuit, but the forest had gone silent again, that expectant, watching silence that had preceded each encounter. As my breathing gradually steadied, rational thought began to reassert itself. Marcus was gone, that much was certain. The realization brought a wave of nausea and self-loathing. I had let go. I had fled. Whatever happened to him in that cabin, I had abandoned him to face it alone. But beneath the guilt lay a more pragmatic concern. I was hopelessly lost in these woods, without light, without reliable navigation, and with something hunting me that defied all natural explanation. My only hope lay in finding my way back to the trail before dawn, before exhaustion rendered me incapable of movement. With shaking hands, I checked my pockets, taking inventory of my meager resources. The compass was useless, but I still had my knife, a lighter, and half a protein bar. No flashlight, no map, no water, it would have to be enough. Rising painfully to my feet, I oriented myself as best I could without stars or landmarks, choosing a direction that I hoped would lead toward lower elevation. As I prepared to move, a sound stopped me cold, that familiar wet scraping now directly behind me. I turned slowly, knife clutched in my trembling hand, and faced the thing that had emerged from between the trees just yards away. In the darkness, its form remained mercifully indistinct, a hulking silhouette of impossible angles and proportions, its shoulders too broad and jointed wrongly, its limbs too long and articulated in places limbs shouldn't bend. But its eyes, those I could see clearly, 2 points of phosphorescent light that contained an intelligence as ancient and cold as the void between stars. It regarded me with those terrible eyes, head tilting at an angle that suggested curiosity rather than imminent attack. Then it made that clicking sound again, a complex pattern that almost seemed like language. One elongated limb extended toward me, ending in what might have been fingers or claws or something for which human language has no adequate term. I raised my knife, a futile gesture against this creature, but defiance was all I had left. It paused, those luminous eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a motion too swift to follow, it lunged forward, and the night dissolved into pain and darkness and the sound of my own screaming. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost meaning in those dark woods, minutes stretching into what felt like hours as I crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs. My lungs burned, each breath tearing through my chest like fire. My legs moved mechanically, driven by pure animal terror rather than conscious will. The thing I still struggle to call it a creature, as that word implies something natural, something that belongs in our world, pursued me with relentless patience. Sometimes I could hear it directly behind me, branches snapping under its weight. Other times the sounds came from my left or right, as if it were hurting me in a specific direction. Most terrifying were the moments of complete silence when I knew it was still there, watching, calculating, toying with me. I had seen it clearly only once, in that moment outside the cabin, and my mind rebelled against forming a coherent image from those fragments of perception. Its proportions followed no natural blueprint: too many joints, limbs that bent at impossible angles, a hide that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. Even now, years later, I can only describe impressions: the suggestion of a massive hunched form, limbs too long and articulated wrongly, a head, if it could be called that seemed to change shape as it moved. What remains most vivid are those eyes, cold points of luminescence that held an intelligence so alien and ancient that meeting their gaze felt like staring into an abyss of evolutionary divergence, a branch of life that developed in parallel to our own but followed radically different principles. As I fled through the darkened forest, my mind cycled through explanations, each less plausible than the last. A bear deformed by radiation or chemical exposure, an undocumented predator, somehow overlooked by science despite its size and distinctive characteristics, a hallucination induced by toxic spores from some rare fungus we'd disturbed. None of these rationalities held up against what I'd witnessed: the methodical arrangement of those bone structures, the symbols carved into the cabin walls, the obvious intelligence behind its pursuit. This was no mindless predator operating on instinct. It was hunting me with purpose and strategy. I stumbled into a shallow creek, the icy water shocking me momentarily out of my panic. Water, direction. Following the flow would lead downhill, eventually to larger bodies of water and perhaps civilization. It was the most basic rule of wilderness survival, one I clung to now like a lifeline. Splashing downstream, I used the water to mask my scent and sound, moving as quickly as the slippery rocks allowed. For a brief period the pursuit sounds faded, giving me hope that I'd gained some advantage. Then I heard it again, that wet dragging sound, now moving parallel to the creek, keeping pace effortlessly despite the rough terrain. The creek broadened, deepening in places to small pools where the water reflected the faint starlight that penetrated the canopy. In one such pool I caught a glimpse of movement beneath the surface, something large displacing water as it passed just inches below where I stood. I froze, watching in horror as the disturbance circled my legs before continuing downstream, faster than any fish or normal aquatic creature could move. It was in the water, it was in the goddamn water. I scrambled up the bank, abandoning the creek strategy and plunging back into the forest. My direction was now completely arbitrary. Just away from that thing that seemed capable of navigating any environment with equal facility. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling face first into the leaf litter. Pain shot through my ankle, accompanied by the distinct pop of overstressed tendons. I bit back a scream, knowing it would only hasten the inevitable, and tried to stand. My ankle buckled immediately, unable to bear weight. I was done. No more running, no more escape. The realization brought a strange calm, the fatalistic acceptance of prey that knows the chase is over. I dragged myself to the base of a massive oak, propping my back against its trunk and drawing my hunting knife, a pathetic defense, but I wouldn't meet my end cowering. The forest had gone silent again, that watching silence that preceded each appearance of the creature. I strained my eyes against the darkness, trying to pinpoint where it would emerge. Nothing moved among the trees. No branches swayed, no undergrowth rustled. Yet I could feel its presence, a heaviness in the air like the pressure before a violent storm. "What do you want?" I called out, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "What the hell are you?" No response came, but the silence itself seemed to deepen, as if the very air were holding its breath. Then gradually I became aware of a vibration. Not a sound exactly, but a physical sensation passing through the ground into my body. It increased in intensity until the leaf litter around me danced with its force, small stones bouncing on the forest floor. From the darkness directly ahead, something moved toward me, a shape blacker than the surrounding night, dimensions shifting as it approached. It stopped about 15 feet away, just at the edge of visibility, its form seeming to blur and refocus constantly, as if my eyes couldn't properly process what they were seeing. Those luminous eyes fixed on me with terrible intelligence. The thing made that clicking sound again, a complex pattern that rose and fell in distinct phrases. Then it extended one elongated limb, pointing first at me, then at the ground beside it, in what seemed unmistakably like a command. I tightened my grip on the knife, preparing for its rush. But it remained stationary, repeating the pointing gesture with deliberate patience, as if dealing with a particularly slow child. After several repetitions, I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't preparing to attack, it was communicating. It wanted me to approach it voluntarily. "No," I said, the word barely audible even to my own ears. The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle, those eyes narrowing slightly. Then it made a new sound, a deep resonant vibration that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and reverberate directly through my skeleton. With it came a sensation of crushing pressure, as if the air itself were compressing around me, forcing the breath from my lungs. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I struggled to breathe. The knife fell from nerveless fingers as I clawed at my throat, fighting against the invisible force constricting it. Just as consciousness began to fade, the pressure released suddenly, leaving me gasping and retching on the forest floor. A warning then. A demonstration of power. The creature remained motionless, watching my recovery with what might have been scientific curiosity. When I had regained some semblance of composure, it repeated the pointing gesture, more emphatically this time. The message was clear: follow willingly, or be compelled by force. With no viable alternatives, I struggled to my feet, wincing as my injured ankle protested the movement. Using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, I limped forward, stopping several yards from the creature. Even at this distance, its wrongness was overwhelming. The way its outline seemed to shimmer and distort as if its physical form were merely an approximation of something my mind couldn't properly comprehend. It turned and began moving into the forest, pausing to ensure I followed. Each step was agony, my ankle throbbing in time with my racing heart, but the memory of that crushing force kept me moving. We proceeded through the darkness, the creature occasionally adjusting its pace to accommodate my labored progress. Our destination became apparent as we approached a familiar location. The clearing ringed with bone structures that Marcus and I had discovered earlier, but now in the deeper darkness, the clearing had transformed. Those bone cairns seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence, casting the entire area in sickly blue-green light. At the center, where earlier I'd glimpsed some larger structure, now stood something that defied rational description. It resembled a doorway or arch, constructed from interlocking bones of various sizes, rising perhaps 12 feet from the forest floor. Within the arch was not the expected view of the forest beyond, but a darkness deeper than the surrounding night, a void that seemed to bend the very light around it, creating an optical distortion that made my eyes water and my head throb when I tried to focus on it. The creature guided me to the edge of the clearing, then stopped, making that complex clicking sound again. Other sounds answered from the darkness, similar patterns coming from multiple directions. As my eyes adjusted to the eerie illumination, I realized with mounting dread that we were not alone. Shapes moved among the trees surrounding the clearing. 5 additional creatures of similar proportion to my captor, emerging from hiding places that should have been too small to conceal their bulk. They converged on the clearing, moving with that same fluid grace that suggested joints and musculature arranged according to principles entirely foreign to earthly biology. As they entered the phosphorescent light, I caught glimpses of their forms, each similar in general shape but with distinct variations, like different breeds of the same impossible species. Some moved on, what appeared to be multiple limbs, others propelled themselves with undulating lower bodies, all shared those luminous eyes filled with cold intelligence. They formed a loose circle around me, exchanging those clicking communications in patterns that suggested language. One approached, extending a limb toward my face. I flinched back, but it moved with blinding speed, seizing my jaw with appendages that felt like wet leather stretched over steel. It turned my head from side to side, examining me with clinical detachment. Another approached, this one smaller but moving with greater agility. It circled me, prodding at my clothing and equipment with evident curiosity. When it reached toward my chest pocket where I kept my Forestry Service ID, I instinctively moved to protect it. The creature reacted instantly, producing that same resonant vibration that had earlier constricted my breathing. This time the pressure localized in my outstretched arm, forcing it down to my side with irresistible strength. Message received. I remained motionless as it extracted the ID, turning the laminated card and its elongated digits, studying the photo and text with apparent interest. After a moment it made a sharp clicking sound and passed the ID to another creature which examined it similarly before discarding it carelessly on the forest floor. Throughout this inspection I fought to maintain some semblance of scientific observation, clinging to professional detachment as a shield against paralyzing terror. These were intelligent beings, capable of complex communication and coordinated action. They displayed curiosity, methodical behavior, and clear social organization. Whatever they were, whether undiscovered terrestrial species or something far stranger, they were not mindless predators. This realization offered cold comfort as they completed their examination and began herding me toward that impossible arch at the clearing's center. As we approached, the darkness within it seemed to deepen, shifting and swirling like a liquid void. The air grew colder, carrying a smell I can only describe as the absence of smell, a negative space where normal sensory input should exist. My captor pushed me forward until I stood directly before the arch, close enough to feel a subtle pull from the darkness within, as if it generated its own gravity. The clicking communications intensified, taking on a rhythmic quality that reminded me disturbingly of chanting. The bone structures surrounding the clearing began to pulse in time with this rhythm, their phosphorescence brightening and dimming in coordinated waves. I knew with sudden, absolute certainty that they intended me to enter that arch, that terrible doorway to wherever these creatures originated. And I knew with equal certainty that doing so would mean the end of anything recognizable as human existence. In that moment of clarity, survival instinct overrode pain and fear. I twisted suddenly, breaking away from my distracted captor and lunging toward the gap between two of the surrounding creatures. My injured ankle screamed in protest but held long enough for me to stagger into the tree line, blind panic lending me strength I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, those clicking voices rose in what could only be alarm, followed by the sounds of pursuit crashing through the undergrowth. I ran without direction or strategy, driven by the primal need to put distance between myself and that abominable doorway. Each step sent daggers of pain up my leg, but fear pushed me forward, deeper into the lightless forest. I don't know how long I fled, or how I evaded recapture in my injured state. Perhaps they expected me to tire quickly. Perhaps something about the forest itself helped conceal my trail. Or perhaps in their alien psychology my desperate flight constituted some form of test or trial, amusing to observe rather than immediately thwart. Whatever the reason, I eventually found myself alone in the darkness, leaning against a tree trunk, my body trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. The pursuit sounds had receded, replaced by the normal nocturnal chorus of insects and wind through branches. I had escaped, temporarily at least. With my ankle now swollen to twice its normal size, continuing to run was impossible. My only option was to find shelter and hope to survive until daylight, when perhaps the creature's activities would be limited. In the dim starlight filtering through the canopy, I spotted a dense thicket nearby. Not ideal protection, but better than remaining exposed. I crawled into the center of the brambles, heedless of the thorns tearing at my clothing and skin, and curled into the smallest target possible. There, surrounded by tangled vegetation, I waited for dawn, straining to detect any sound of approaching predators while fighting the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. As the adrenaline ebbed, the full horror of the night's events crashed down upon me. Marcus was gone, taken or killed by these things for purposes I couldn't begin to comprehend. I had been examined like a laboratory specimen, nearly forced through some kind of doorway to an unknown destination, and somewhere in these woods at least 6 of those creatures still moved with terrible purpose, perhaps even now searching for their escaped subject. Sleep was impossible, yet my battered body demanded rest. I drifted in and out of a twilight state, jerking fully awake at every snapping twig or rustling leaf, certain each time that discovery was imminent. During one such period of semi-consciousness, I became aware of a gradual lightening of the forest, not dawn yet, but the first hint that night was finally retreating. With this faint illumination came an unexpected sound, distant but unmistakable. A vehicle engine, somewhere far below my position. Civilization, safety, or at least the chance of it. Gathering the last reserves of my strength, I crawled from the thicket and oriented myself toward the sound. The forest sloped downward in that direction, suggesting a road in the valley below. If I could reach it before the creatures found me again, I might survive to tell this impossible story. And so began the most painful journey of my life. Half crawling, half dragging myself down the forested slope using trees for support and crude walking sticks fashioned from fallen branches. Each movement was an exercise in agony. My injured ankle now completely useless, forcing me to essentially hop on one leg while balancing with my makeshift crutches. The forest seemed to conspire against my progress, throwing up obstacles at every turn. Dense underbrush, hidden depressions, fallen trees too large to easily circumvent. Yet the sound of engines grew gradually louder, confirming I was moving in the right direction. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions for the hunted, began to flicker within me. As gray pre-dawn light filtered through the trees, I caught glimpses of what appeared to be a paved surface through the thinning forest ahead. A road, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, so close. Yet in my condition, it might as well have been 10 miles. I pressed on, abandoning caution for speed, making more noise than was wise in my desperate push toward safety. The road was now clearly visible, a 2-lane highway cutting through the valley below, with occasional vehicles passing in the early morning light. 200 yards, 150. The forest was thinning, transitioning to scrubby second growth near the roadside. 100 yards. I could distinguish individual vehicles now, mostly logging trucks and the occasional passenger car. 75 yards. That's when I heard it again, that wet dragging sound directly behind me. I didn't need to turn to know what followed, could feel those luminous eyes boring into my back with predatory intensity. It had found me, tracked me through miles of dense forest despite my desperate attempts at evasion. 50 yards from safety, I made a final desperate push, abandoning my makeshift crutches and simply hurling myself forward, half falling down the remaining slope. Behind me, the creature closed the distance with terrifying speed, no longer bothering with stealth. I could hear branches snapping under its weight, feel the ground vibrate with its approach. 25 yards. The road was right there, morning sunlight glinting off the asphalt. A logging truck approached from the south, moving at considerable speed. If I could just reach the roadside in time to flag it down. 10 yards. I was crawling now, my body having finally surrendered to exhaustion and injury. The creature was almost upon me. I could smell its strange, acrid odor, hear its clicking communication, presumably calling to its companions. 5 yards. The truck was passing, its driver oblivious to the life-or-death drama unfolding just beyond his field of vision. I summoned the last dregs of my strength, raised myself to my knees, and waved frantically, a hoarse cry tearing from my raw throat. The truck's brakes squealed as the driver spotted me, the massive vehicle slowing and pulling onto the shoulder perhaps 50 yards beyond my position. Behind me, the creature hesitated, suddenly confronted with potential witnesses in the harsh light of dawn. I crawled the final distance to the road's edge, collapsing onto the gravel shoulder as the truck driver jogged back toward me, shouting questions I couldn't process through the roaring in my ears. I turned my head, seeking a final glimpse of my pursuer, but the tree line stood empty now. The creature had vanished, retreating back into the depths of the forest from which it had emerged. As the driver reached me, his weathered face contorting with alarm at my condition, I felt consciousness finally slipping away. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was looking past him, back toward those accursed woods, and seeing movement among the distant trees, not the creature itself, but the subtle shifting of branches that suggested something large withdrawing deeper into shadow. Then there was only blackness and the blessed release of oblivion. I awoke to the antiseptic smell of a hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment, and the dull throb of injuries partially masked by medication. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh illumination a stark contrast to the darkness of Sultua Point. For several disoriented moments, I couldn't reconcile these surroundings with my last conscious memories. A nurse noticed my stirring and approached, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. "Welcome back," she said, adjusting my IV drip. "You've been out for nearly 20 hours. Doctor will want to know you're awake." "Where?" My voice emerged as a croak, my throat raw from screaming and dehydration. "Marquette General Hospital," she replied, offering a plastic cup of water. "Logging truck brought you in yesterday morning. You were in pretty rough shape." As awareness returned, so did the memories, the bone towers, the cabin, Marcus's scream, those luminous eyes watching from the darkness. I tried to sit up, panic surging through me. There was someone with me. Marcus, the intern. Did they find him? Is he here? The nurse gently pushed me back against the pillows. "Easy now. You were alone when they found you. Highway Patrol sent a team to search the area after you were brought in, but I haven't heard anything about finding anyone else." Of course they hadn't. Whatever fate had befallen Marcus, it wasn't one that would leave evidence easily discovered by a routine search party. A hollow ache spread through my chest, guilt mingling with the physical pain of my injuries. A doctor arrived soon after, a grave-faced woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Rivera. She examined me thoroughly, cataloging my injuries with clinical detachment: severe sprain to the right ankle with partial tendon tear, multiple lacerations and contusions, mild hypothermia, dehydration, exhaustion. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Red Bear," she concluded, making notes on her tablet. "Can you tell me what happened out there?" The question hung in the air between us. What could I possibly say? That ancient inhuman creatures stalked Michigan's forests, building monuments from bones and opening doorways to somewhere else. That they had taken or killed my intern and nearly done the same to me. The truth would sound like the ravings of a man in shock or suffering hallucinations. "Got separated from my partner during a forestry survey," I said finally. "Fell and injured my ankle. Got disoriented trying to find my way out." Dr. Rivera studied me over her glasses, clearly recognizing the inadequacy of this explanation but professional enough not to press. "The police will want to take a statement once you're more stable. They've organized a search for your missing colleague." I nodded, knowing the search would yield nothing. "When can I leave?" "We'd like to keep you under observation for at least another day. That ankle needs proper immobilization and we're still concerned about potential infection in some of those deeper lacerations." After she left, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened and what might come next. Would the creatures remain in their territory, or would they pursue me now that I'd seen them? What was that doorway in the clearing, and where did it lead? And most troublingly, Why had they released me when capture had seemed certain? My thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a police officer, a young state trooper who introduced himself as Officer Kopinski. He pulled up a chair beside my bed, notebook in hand. "Mr. Red Bear, I understand you're still recovering, but we need some information to help locate your missing colleague." I provided Marcus's full name and what little I knew of his background. Graduate student at Northern Michigan University, studying conservation biology, assigned as my intern for the Sultua Point survey. When asked about the circumstances of our separation, I repeated the sanitized version I'd given Dr. Rivera, adding fabricated details about areas we'd already searched to direct the rescue teams away from the clearing in the cabin. "And you have no idea what might have happened to him?" Kopinski pressed, clearly sensing omissions in my account. I shook my head. "We got separated in the dark. I called for him, but..." I let the sentence trail off, not trusting myself to elaborate convincingly. The officer made a few more notes, then closed his notebook. "We'll continue searching, but I should warn you. Those woods are extensive, and if he's injured and unable to signal..." He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. After Kopinski left, a new visitor arrived. My supervisor from the forestry department, Alan Richards. He looked haggard, his normally neat appearance disheveled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "Jesus, Clyde," he said, dropping heavily into the chair. "What the hell happened out there?" Again, I provided the simplified version, but Alan knew me too well to accept it fully. We'd worked together for nearly a decade, and he'd never known me to get disoriented in familiar territory, regardless of conditions. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "the university is raising hell about their missing student. There's talk of negligence, inadequate safety protocols. I need to know exactly what went down." I met his gaze steadily. "I told you what happened, Alan. We got separated. I got injured. End of story." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "The area's been placed off limits pending the investigation. No one's allowed in until they either find the kid or, well, until the search is called off." "Good," I said, perhaps too emphatically. "That's probably for the best." Alan's eyebrows rose slightly at my tone, but he didn't pursue it. Instead, he switched to practicalities. My medical leave, paperwork for the incident report, arrangements for my transportation home once discharged. Throughout the conversation, I could sense his unasked questions, his awareness that I was withholding significant information. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Whatever really happened out there, Clyde? Was it something that might endanger the search teams?" The question caught me off guard. I considered lying, then decided against it. These people were walking into danger blindly. They deserved at least a warning, however cryptic. "Tell them to stay out of the old-growth section near the creek," I said carefully. "And if they find a cabin, don't enter it, just don't." Alan nodded slowly, accepting this bizarre advice without further question. A testament to our years of mutual trust. "I'll pass it along. Rest up, Clyde." After he left, I spent hours staring at the window, watching daylight fade into dusk. Sleep evaded me despite the sedatives coursing through my system. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bone towers, that impossible doorway, those luminous eyes watching with alien intelligence. The next day brought a parade of additional visitors, more police officers, a representative from the university asking pointed questions about the circumstances of Marcus's disappearance, even a reporter from the local paper whom I refused to speak with. By afternoon, I had retreated into monosyllabic responses, claiming exhaustion to avoid detailed questioning. Dr. Rivera, sensing my deteriorating mental state, limited further visits and arranged for a consultation with the hospital's psychiatric department. The psychiatrist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Chen, recognized the signs of acute trauma and recommended against pushing me for a complete account of events until I had time to process the experience. "Whatever happened in those woods clearly left psychological wounds alongside the physical ones," she explained to the frustrated detective who had replaced Officer Kopinski. "Forcing him to relive it now could cause additional trauma." I was discharged 3 days later, my ankle immobilized in a walking boot with prescriptions for pain medication, antibiotics, and sleep aids. Alan arranged for a department vehicle to transport me back to my cabin near Munising, where I lived alone except for an aging retriever named Scout. The search for Marcus continued for another 2 weeks before being officially classified as a recovery operation rather than a rescue. They never found his body. The official report eventually concluded he had likely fallen into one of the numerous sinkholes that pockmarked the karstal landscape of Sultua Point, his remains perhaps washed into the extensive underground cave system that honeycombed the region. I didn't correct this assumption. What purpose would it serve other than to destroy my credibility and career? Who would believe the truth? And more dangerously, who might be inspired to investigate that clearing, that cabin, those bone towers for themselves? Instead, I retreated into isolation, taking extended medical leave that gradually transformed into a desk position analyzing survey data rather than collecting it. I never returned to fieldwork, citing my injured ankle as the reason. The truth that I couldn't bear to enter any forest, knowing what might lurk in its depths, remained my secret. In the months that followed, I conducted my own investigation, researching historical records and native legends associated with Sultua Point. The area I discovered had a long history of disappearances dating back to the earliest European exploration. Native stories spoke of it as a thin place where entities from elsewhere could cross into our world, a description that aligned disturbingly with that bone-framed doorway I had witnessed. Most tellingly, I found references in Chippewa oral histories to the Watchers at the Threshold, beings who guarded certain sacred or forbidden locations against human trespass. The descriptions, while cloaked in metaphor and spiritual language, contained elements that matched my experience. Creatures of fluid form, with too many joints and cold eyes, their preference for darkness, their ability to move through water and earth with equal facility, their construction of spirit houses from the bones of their victims. These discoveries brought no comfort, only confirmation that what I had encountered was known to indigenous peoples long before European settlement. The creatures were not new to these lands. They had always been here, allowing human civilization to expand around their territories while maintaining their own hidden domains. 6 months after the incident, I received an unexpected package at my office. A battered digital camera in a sealed evidence bag, accompanied by a note from Alan. Found in the search area, it read, "Technically should go to his family, but thought you might want to see it first." Marcus's camera. I stared at it for hours before finding the courage to extract the memory card and view its contents. Most images were what you would expect from a forestry survey. Plant specimens, soil samples, GPS-tagged landscapes. Then came the photographs from that final day. The strange gouges in the earth, the unnatural trench with its polished walls, the twisted trees with their geometric scars, and finally, partially obscured by branches but unmistakable, a glimpse of one of the bone towers at the clearing's edge. But the most disturbing image was the last one taken, according to the timestamp just moments before we fled from the clearing. It showed a section of forest where nothing appeared to be present, just trees and undergrowth. Yet in the upper corner, barely visible, was a distortion in the air, a warping of light and space around what seemed to be empty forest. When I enlarged this section and enhanced the contrast, I nearly dropped the camera. Within that distortion, barely perceptible, was the outline of one of the creatures, its form transparent and wavering, but its eyes clear and focused directly on the camera lens. It had been there, watching us before we even knew we were being stalked. I deleted the images, then physically destroyed the memory card, breaking it into pieces and disposing of them in separate locations. The empty camera I returned to Alan, claiming the card had been damaged and unreadable. He accepted this without question, perhaps relieved to be spared whatever traumatic images it might have contained. Life gradually resumed a semblance of normalcy. I moved to a different town, took a new position with the parks department that kept me firmly behind a desk, began seeing a therapist under the guise of processing grief for my lost colleague. I never mentioned the true nature of what I'd witnessed in those woods, framing my trauma in terms of survivor's guilt and the stress of the ordeal. Years passed. The nightmares receded from nightly terrors to occasional disturbances. I developed routines that allowed me to function: medication, therapy, careful avoidance of triggers like dense forests or darkness. I even managed to form relationships, though none lasted. The weight of my unshared experience created a barrier too substantial to overcome. Then, last month, I received a letter. No return address, just my name and current location inscribed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single page containing a crude drawing of one of the bone towers, and beneath it coordinates for a location in the western Upper Peninsula, far from Sultua Point, but similarly remote. Below these, a message: "They're spreading, more doorways opening, need your help." I burned the letter immediately, but its contents had already scarred themselves into my memory. Someone else had encountered these creatures, recognized what they were, and somehow connected them to me. The implications were terrifying. Not just that the entities were expanding their territory, but that knowledge of them was spreading among humans. I've spent weeks debating what to do with this information. Report it to authorities. They would dismiss it as the ravings of a traumatized mind, or worse, investigate and send more innocent people into danger. Ignore it. How could I live with myself if others suffered what Marcus did, knowing I might have prevented it? In the end, I've chosen this middle path, recording my experience in full, finally giving honest voice to what I witnessed in those accursed woods. I don't expect to be believed. I don't seek validation or even understanding. This account exists solely as warning and testimony, to be discovered should others encounter these entities and seek answers. As for me, I've made my decision. Tomorrow I leave for the coordinates provided in that anonymous letter. I go prepared this time, not with weapons, which proved useless against these creatures, but with knowledge. I've spent years researching similar phenomena, corresponding discreetly with indigenous elders and cryptozoological researchers, gathering what fragmentary information exists about these entities and their potential vulnerabilities. I harbor no illusions about my chances of success or even survival. But Marcus deserves justice or at least understanding. And if these doorways are indeed proliferating, someone must document them, must understand what comes through them and why. If you're reading this, it likely means I haven't returned. In that case, heed my warning. There are places in this world where reality thins, where things from elsewhere can cross into our domain. Sultua Point is one such place. There are others, their numbers potentially growing. Respect the old boundaries, the forgotten territories, the places where even animals fall silent. And if you find yourself in deep woods and sense that watching silence, if you discover strange markings or structures that defy natural explanation, do what I failed to do 17 years ago. Run. Run without looking back. Run until you reach light and civilization and the comforting din of human activity. Because in the dark spaces between trees, in the shadows that move against the wind, in the silence that falls too suddenly across a forest path, they are watching, waiting, their cold, luminous eyes fixed on the next unwitting trespasser to cross their threshold. And unlike me, you may not be allowed to escape to tell your tale. I've always hated camping. It's not that I'm afraid of the woods or anything. At least that's what I told myself back then. It's just the idea of sleeping on the ground, dealing with bugs crawling over your skin in the dead of night, and being miles away from the nearest decent cup of coffee. My name is Kellen Highland, and in 2015 I found myself roped into a camping trip with a few old friends from college. They had this idea that a trip to the Sierra Nevada mountains would be the perfect way to reconnect after years of growing apart, of becoming strangers wearing familiar faces. I should have known better. We'd all gathered at this spot we used to hike to back in the day. A remote lake nestled high in the mountains, surrounded by thick pines that seemed to lean inward like they were trying to hide something. The towering peaks looked down on us like ancient sentinels, their faces carved with shadows that never seemed to shift, no matter how the sun moved across the sky. The place was beautiful. I'll give it that. But beautiful can quickly turn into terrifying under the right circumstances, and beauty in isolation often masks something rotten underneath. My buddy Ren was the ringleader of this operation the same way he'd been in college when he'd convince us to sneak into abandoned buildings or explore the steam tunnels beneath campus. He was always the adventurous type, the kind of guy who would suggest cliff diving into an icy river just for fun, who'd push boundaries until they snapped back and bit him. His enthusiasm was infectious but dangerous, the kind that made you forget why certain places were left alone. Then there was Eli, the sarcastic, skeptical one, who constantly made jokes about us getting eaten by bears. His humor was his armor, deflecting genuine fear with nervous laughter that always rang a little too hollow. Nico was the quiet one, but also the most knowledgeable about the outdoors. He moved through the wilderness like he belonged there, reading signs in bent twigs and disturbed earth that the rest of us couldn't even see. And then me. Well, I was the reluctant participant, dragged along more for old time's sake than for any love of nature. The drive up had been uneventful, though I'd noticed how the radio stations gradually faded to static as we climbed higher into the mountains. Cell service died somewhere around mile marker 47, leaving us truly cut off from the outside world. The last gas station we'd passed was over 60 miles behind us, run by a weathered old man who'd given us a strange look when Ren mentioned our destination. "That lake?" he'd asked, his eyes narrowing. "You boys be careful up there. Things change when the sun goes down in the mountains." Eli had laughed it off as typical mountain folklore, but I'd noticed the old man wasn't smiling. We arrived at the lake around noon, our boots crunching on pine needles that seemed unusually thick, as if no one had walked this trail in months. The silence was the first thing that struck me, not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an oppressive absence of sound that made our voices seem too loud, too intrusive. Even our breathing felt like a violation of something sacred and forbidden. Setting up camp was surprisingly smooth. Ren and Nico handled most of it while Eli and I complained about the lack of cell service, though our jokes about being digital refugees felt forced. We spent the afternoon fishing in the crystal clear lake, whose depths seemed to go down forever, dark and impenetrable despite the clarity near the surface. The fish we caught were larger than expected, but their eyes looked wrong somehow, cloudy and unfocused, as if they'd been living in deeper, darker waters than this shallow mountain lake should have provided. As we lounged around after lunch, I noticed other oddities. The trees around the lake all seemed to lean slightly inward, their branches forming an almost perfect canopy overhead that blocked out more sunlight than it should have. Birds flew overhead but never landed near our campsite, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed by something patient and calculating. When I mentioned this to the others, Nico nodded slowly. "Animals can sense things," he said quietly. "They know when a place isn't right." By nightfall, we had a decent fire going, and were grilling the fish we'd caught. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the fire itself. reaching toward the tree line like grasping fingers. That's when things started to get weird, though. Looking back, the weirdness had been there all along. We'd just been too busy setting up camp and falling back into old patterns of friendship to notice. It began with strange noises coming from the woods. At first, it was just the typical rustling of leaves and snapping of twigs, nothing unusual for a forest at night. But as the darkness deepened around us like a physical weight, the sounds became more pronounced, more deliberate. It was like something or someone was moving around us in a careful pattern, staying just out of sight, but making sure we knew it was there. The sounds came from different directions, sometimes seeming to circle our campsite in a slow, methodical orbit. Probably just a deer or something, Ren said, poking at the fire with a stick. He was trying to sound nonchalant, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way his hand gripped the stick a little too tightly. The fire hissed and spat as he disturbed it, sending sparks spiraling up into the canopy where they disappeared like dying stars. Yeah, or a serial killer, Eli chimed in, rolling his eyes. Great idea, Ren. Middle of nowhere. No cell service, perfect setting for a horror movie. His voice carried that familiar edge of sarcasm, but underneath it I could hear genuine unease. We all could. Shut up, Eli, Nico muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He was peering into the darkness beyond our fire's reach, his face serious and alert. Unlike the rest of us, he wasn't trying to dismiss what we were hearing. It's probably nothing, he continued, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. But we should be careful. Animals up here can be unpredictable. We all tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere had changed. The light-hearted banter of earlier was replaced by a tense silence that seemed to press against us from all sides. The darkness beyond our fire felt alive, pulsing with hidden movement and watching eyes. We kept our conversation low, almost as if we were afraid of being overheard by whatever was moving through the trees around us. The temperature began to drop as the night wore on, but it wasn't the gradual cooling you'd expect in the mountains. It came in waves, sudden chills that would wash over us and then recede, leaving us shivering and drawing closer to the fire. Our breath began to mist despite the fact that it had been warm when we'd arrived. Nico checked his thermometer and frowned. This doesn't make sense, he murmured. It was 70 degrees when we got here. Now it's reading 43. Around midnight, the noises stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sounds had been, a complete and utter absence of life that seemed to suck the warmth from our bones. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, its flames smaller and less vibrant than they'd been moments before. The darkness pressed closer, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving just at the edge of our vision, shadows that shouldn't have been there. We decided to call it a night, retreating to our tents like soldiers falling back to a defensive position. I was sharing a tent with Eli, and as we settled into our sleeping bags, the nylon walls seemed thin and inadequate against whatever was out there. The fabric rippled in a breeze that didn't seem to affect anything else, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was testing the boundaries of our temporary shelter. You feel that? Eli whispered, his voice tight with fear he was no longer trying to hide. Like something's watching us? Yeah, I replied, though I didn't really want to admit it. The sensation was like ice water in my veins, a primal recognition of predator and prey that made every nerve in my body scream for us to run. Just go to sleep, man. Everything will look different in the morning. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the oppressive silence and feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon us. The darkness outside our tent wasn't just the absence of light. It was something thick and malevolent, something that had been waiting for us long before we'd arrived at this cursed place. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by Eli shaking me violently. His hands were trembling, and in the dim glow of his phone screen, I could see that his face was pale and slick with sweat. Listen, he hissed, his voice barely audible but urgent. Do you hear that? I strained my ears against the oppressive silence, and then I heard it, a low rhythmic thumping sound, like heavy footsteps but wrong somehow. The rhythm was too slow, too deliberate, and each step seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath us. It was the sound of something massive moving with purpose, each footfall calculated and predatory. My heart began to pound in my chest, the blood rushing so loudly in my ears that I almost missed the next sound. A deep rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground, as if the earth itself was in pain. The sound was so low it was felt more than heard, a vibration that made our teeth ache and our bones feel hollow. What the hell is that? Eli whispered, his voice cracking. His phone screen flickered and died, leaving us in complete darkness. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. The beam weak and yellow in the thick darkness. The light seemed to be absorbed by the tent walls rather than illuminating them properly, creating a sickly claustrophobic glow that made everything look diseased. Stay here, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it more for Eli's benefit or my own. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the tent zipper. I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and stepped outside into the cold night air. The temperature had dropped even further, and my breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the air longer than they should have. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a weak reddish glow over our campsite that made everything look like a scene from hell. Ren and Nico were already up, standing by the remains of the fire. Their faces were pale and drawn in the dim light. Their eyes wide with fear, they were no longer trying to hide. They looked like they'd aged years in the few hours since we'd gone to sleep. "You hear that?" Ren asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gone was his earlier bravado, replaced by something raw and terrified. "Yeah," I replied, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the unnatural quiet. "What the hell is it?" Nico shook his head slowly, his usual confidence completely shattered. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's close, really close." We stood there paralyzed by fear, listening to the heavy footsteps circling our campsite. They seemed to be coming from all directions now, an impossible feat unless there was more than one of whatever was out there. The sounds would shift from the north side of our camp to the south, then east to west, as if multiple creatures were coordinating their movements around us. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the intelligence behind the pattern. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was deliberate, calculated, like something was studying us. "Maybe we should leave," Eli said from behind me, his voice trembling. He'd emerged from the tent and was standing close enough that I could feel him shaking. "Just pack up and hike out of here. Leave and go where?" Ren snapped, some of his old fire returning. "We're miles from the car, and stumbling around in the dark isn't exactly a smart move. We'd be even more vulnerable out there." As we debated our next move, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been, a complete absence of sound that made our ears ring and our hearts hammer against our ribs. We stood there holding our breath, waiting for anything to happen. The very air seemed to be holding its breath along with us. And then we saw it. A massive figure emerged from the tree line, moving with a fluid grace that was completely at odds with its enormous size. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with broad shoulders and a muscular build that spoke of inhuman strength. But it was the details that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Its skin was rough and dark, almost like tree bark, but it moved and flexed like living flesh. Patches of what looked like moss or lichen grew across its shoulders and arms, and its fingers ended in claws that caught the firelight like polished obsidian. But it was the eyes that nearly broke my sanity. They were large and luminous like twin pools of starlight, but there was something fundamentally wrong with them. They held an intelligence that was alien and ancient, something that had been thinking and planning since before humans had learned to make fire. When those eyes fixed on us, I felt like a mouse being studied by a particularly patient cat. The creature's face was almost human in basic structure, but elongated and distorted, as if someone had taken a human skull and stretched it like clay. Its mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. When it breathed, I could see vapor rising from its nostrils like smoke from a dragon's snout. "What the fuck is that?" Eli whispered, his voice barely audible but seeming to echo in the stillness. The creature's head turned toward him with a movement that was too fluid, too smooth. When it focused on Eli, I saw my friend's knees nearly buckle. The thing's attention was like a physical weight, pressing down on us with the force of a mountain. But the worst part, the part that still haunts my dreams, was the way it studied us. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. This was something that was evaluating us, determining our worth, deciding what to do with us. The intelligence behind those glowing eyes was vast and cold and utterly without mercy. The creature took a step forward, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we were completely outmatched. We had no weapons beyond our camping knives, no way to defend ourselves against something like this. The very air around the creature seemed to shimmer with an energy that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. Rain, ever the fool even in the face of the impossible, grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it out like a torch. "Back off," he yelled, though his voice wavered and cracked. "Stay away from us." The creature didn't even flinch. If anything, it seemed amused by Ren's pathetic display of defiance. Its lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wetly in the firelight. The sound it made, a low rumbling chuckle, was like stones grinding together in the depths of the earth. That's when we realized we weren't alone with just one creature. More shapes began to emerge from the tree line, moving with the same fluid grace as the first creature. They were similar in build but different in detail. Some taller, some broader, all of them radiating that same ancient intelligence and predatory hunger. Their eyes reflected the dying firelight like a pack of wolves, but these were no earthly predators. These were something far older and far more dangerous. I counted at least 6 of them, though more shapes moved in the deeper darkness beyond our camp. They arranged themselves in a rough circle around us, cutting off any hope of escape. The coordination was perfect, military in its precision. Whatever these things were, they had done this before. Jesus Christ, Nico breathed, his voice thick with terror. There's so many of them. The creatures didn't attack immediately. Instead, they seemed content to watch us, to study our every movement and reaction. It was like being examined by a team of scientists, except we were the lab rats, and they were deciding which experiment to run first. The largest of them, the one we'd first seen, took another step closer, and I could smell it now, a mixture of earth and decay and something else, something that spoke of deep places where no light had ever shone. That's when Nico broke. "Run," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the paralytic fear that had gripped us. "We need to run, now." Without waiting for a response, he took off into the woods, crashing through the underbrush like a man possessed. The sound of breaking branches and crushing leaves was impossibly loud in the unnatural silence, and I realized with horror that he was making enough noise to wake the dead. The effect on the creatures was immediate and terrifying. Their heads snapped toward Nico's fleeing form with predatory precision, and I could see their muscles tensing beneath their bark-like skin. They were built for the hunt, and Nico had just triggered every instinct they possessed. But they didn't chase him. Not yet. Instead, the largest creature turned back to us, its luminous eyes fixing on each of us in turn. When its gaze met mine, I felt something probe at the edges of my mind, a cold presence that tried to worm its way inside my thoughts. I could sense amusement there, and anticipation, and something that might have been hunger. It knew exactly what it was doing to us. The creature opened its mouth and spoke. The voice that emerged was like stones grinding in a millstone, impossibly deep and resonant. But worse than the sound was the fact that I could understand it, the words forming in my mind even though they came from no human throat. "Run," it said, the single word carrying depths of meaning that made my soul shrivel. "We give you a head start." The rest of us hesitated for a split second, our minds struggling to process what we'd just heard. A talking monster was bad enough, but one that played games with its prey was infinitely worse. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a hunt, it was entertainment. Eli was the first to react, turning and sprinting toward the tray line opposite from where Nico had disappeared. The remaining creatures watched him go with what I can only describe as satisfaction, their eyes tracking his movement like cats watching a mouse scurry across the floor. Ren grabbed my arm, his fingers digging deep enough to leave bruises. "Move," he hissed, and together we crashed through the underbrush in yet another direction, leaving our campsite and our gear behind. The forest closed around us like a living thing, branches whipping against our faces and roots trying to trip us with every step. The darkness was absolute beneath the canopy, and our flashlights seemed pitiful against the oppressive blackness. I could hear Ren's labored breathing beside me, punctuated by whispered curses every time he stumbled. Behind us I could hear the creatures beginning to move, but they weren't running. They were walking, taking their time, savoring the hunt. The sound of their footsteps was steady and unhurried, like they knew exactly where we were going and how long it would take us to get there. We stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Time seemed distorted in that place, stretching and contracting like a living thing. The trees all looked the same in the darkness, massive pines that seemed to lean in from all sides, creating a maze of shadows and dead ends. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere off to our left, a sound of pure terror and agony that echoed through the forest like the cry of a damned soul. The voice was Eli's, and it went on far longer than any human scream should, rising and falling in waves of pain and fear. "Eli!" Ren called out, starting to turn toward the sound. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "No," I said, my voice harsh and desperate. "It's what they want. They're hurting us." Ren's eyes were wild in the beam of my flashlight, but he nodded and we kept running. The screaming continued for several more seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. We pressed deeper into the forest, our lungs burning and our legs feeling like lead. The creature's footsteps continued behind us, never getting closer but never falling behind either. They were playing with us, letting us exhaust ourselves while they conserved their strength for the final act. It was then that I realized the horrible truth. This wasn't a forest anymore. This was an arena, and we were the gladiators. The creatures had turned these mountains into their hunting ground, and we were just the latest prey to stumble into their trap. A second scream pierced the night, different from the first. This one was Nico's voice, coming from somewhere far to our right. The sound was cut short just like Eli's had been, leaving us with the terrible knowledge that we were now alone. "It's just us," Ren whispered, his voice thick with despair. They got them both. We kept running, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grow thicker with every step. The creatures were still behind us, their presence a constant weight on our minds. But something had changed in the quality of their pursuit. They were getting closer now, no longer content to simply follow. The game was entering its final phase. We ran down the center of the road, our footsteps echoing off the surrounding trees. Behind us, I could hear the creatures emerging from the forest, but they stopped at the tree line. When I looked back, I could see their glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight, but they came no further. "Why aren't they following?" Ren gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. I looked back at the creatures, still standing motionless at the forest's edge, and a terrible realization washed over me. "They don't need to," I said. "They know exactly where this road leads." We ran down that dirt road like the hounds of hell were nipping at our heels, which wasn't far from the truth. Our footsteps echoed in the moonlight, the only sound in a world that had gone completely silent. Even the wind had died, leaving the air still and oppressive, heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something that smelled like old graves and forgotten fears. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the mountains like a serpent. Every shadow could have hidden one of those creatures. Every bend in the road could have been an ambush. But we kept running because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant acknowledging what had just happened to Eli and Nico. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, we saw a light in the distance. As we got closer, it resolved into a small building with a sign that read Sequoia Ridge Ranger Station. It was a modest wooden structure, probably built in the 1970s, with a single light burning in the window and an old pickup truck parked out front. We stumbled up to the door and began pounding on it with our fists, the sound abnormally loud in the mountain silence. "Help," Ren shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and terror. "Please, somebody help us." After what seemed like an eternity, we heard movement inside. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man in a rumpled ranger uniform, his graying hair disheveled from sleep. He looked us over with tired, bloodshot eyes, taking in our torn clothes, scratched faces, and wild expressions. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gravelly with sleep. "What are you boys doing out here at this hour?" "There's something out there," Ren said, his voice shaking. "Something big. It killed our friends." The ranger, his name tag read William Torres, frowned and stepped back to let us inside. The station was small and cramped, filled with maps and radio equipment. A coffee pot sat on a hot plate in one corner, filling the air with the comforting smell of caffeine and normalcy. "Slow down," Torres said, pouring us cups of coffee with steady hands. "Start from the beginning. What happened?" We told him everything. The camping trip, the sounds in the night, the creatures that had emerged from the trees. As we spoke, I watched his expression carefully, expecting skepticism or disbelief. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Recognition. "You boys were camping up at Mirror Lake, weren't you?" he asked quietly. "How did you know?" I asked. Torres walked over to a wall map and pointed to a small blue dot high in the mountains. "It's the only lake within hiking distance of where this road starts. And it's not the first time I've had people come stumbling out of those woods with stories like yours." Ren leaned forward in his chair. "You mean this has happened before?" "More times than I care to count," Torres said, settling heavily into his desk chair. "Always the same pattern. Groups of campers go up to that lake, something happens in the night, and the survivors come running down this road looking like they've seen the devil himself." "Survivors?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "There are always survivors," Torres said grimly. "Never everyone, but always someone left to tell the tale. It's like whatever's up there wants the stories to spread." He pulled out a thick file folder from his desk drawer and opened it on the desk between us. Inside were dozens of police reports, witness statements, and missing person cases, all dating back over the past decade. The photographs clipped to the reports showed people who looked just like us, young, terrified, traumatized. "What are they?" Ren asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Torres shrugged. "Officially, nothing. The Forest Service maintains there's no evidence of any unusual activity in the area. Unofficially." He leaned back in his chair and fixed us with a steady gaze. "I've been working these mountains for 23 years, and I've learned that some places are just wrong. They've always been wrong, probably since before the first humans set foot in these mountains." He pulled out a particularly thick report and showed us the cover page. It was dated 15 years earlier, and bore the official seal of the Forest Service. This was the first documented incident. A family of 5 went camping up at Mirror Lake. 3 days later, the father came stumbling down this same road, babbling about monsters in the trees. They found the bodies of his wife and 2 children a week later, scattered across several miles of forest. "What about the 3rd child?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Never found," Torres said simply, "just like the 15 other people who've gone missing up there over the years." I felt sick. 15 people? 15 that we know of, Torres corrected. "Could be more. The creatures are smart about it. They always leave survivors to carry the story, but they make sure the authorities can never find enough evidence to warrant a real investigation." Ren slammed his fist on the desk. "Then why don't you people close the area, put up warning signs, block the trail? Torres gave him a sad smile. We tried. 3 times in the past decade we've had the trail officially closed. But people keep going up there anyway. The signs get torn down, the barriers get moved, and the campers keep coming. It's like the place calls to them. He walked over to the radio equipment and began turning dials. I'm calling for backup, he said. We'll need a search team to go up there and look for your friends. But as he tried different frequencies, all we got was static. The radio crackled and hissed, but no human voices came through the speakers. Torres frowned and tried his cell phone, but there was no signal. That's odd, he muttered. Radio usually works fine up here. As if in response to his words, the lights in the station flickered. We all looked up at the fluorescent fixtures as they buzzed and dimmed, casting strange shadows on the walls. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in as many seconds. They're coming, I said, the words falling from my lips before I even realized I was speaking. Torres looked at me sharply. What did you say? They're coming, I repeated, more certain now. They followed us here, as if to confirm my words. A sound drifted through the walls of the station, that same low rhythmic thumping we'd heard at our campsite. But this time it was accompanied by something new, the sound of wood splintering and metal groaning, as if something impossibly strong was testing the structural integrity of the building. Torres moved quickly to a gun cabinet and pulled out a shotgun, checking to make sure it was loaded. Get away from the windows, he ordered, his voice calm and professional despite the circumstances. But as we huddled in the center of the room, I realized that hiding wasn't going to save us this time. The creatures had followed us here for a reason, and they weren't going to be satisfied with just scaring us anymore. The hunting ground had expanded, and we were still the prey. The sounds outside the ranger station grew louder and more deliberate. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. They wanted us to know they were coming. The wooden walls of the building creaked and groaned under some invisible pressure, as if the very structure was being tested by forces it was never designed to withstand. Torres moved with practiced efficiency, checking the shotgun's action and gathering extra shells from a drawer. How many of them did you see, he asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. At least 6, I replied, watching the windows for any sign of movement, maybe more. The ranger nodded grimly. That's more than usual. They're getting bolder. More than usual? Ren's voice cracked. You mean you've faced these things before? Once, Torres said, moving to the radio again and trying different frequencies. Still nothing but static. 3 years ago, a family of 4 went missing, and I went up to investigate, found their campsite torn apart, and other things. One of those creatures tracked me back here. What happened? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I got lucky, Torres said simply. Had a hunting rifle with me that night, and apparently they don't like loud noises. But this is different. This many of them working together, he trailed off, shaking his head. The lights flickered again, staying dim for longer this time. In the reduced illumination, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move independently, reaching toward us with fingers of darkness. The coffee pot began to make a sound like a dying animal, steam hissing from its spout in irregular bursts. That's when we heard the voices. They came from outside, carried on a wind that shouldn't have existed. But these weren't the grinding, stone-like voices of the creatures. These were human voices, familiar human voices. Kellen? Eli's voice drifted through the walls, plaintive and confused. Kellen, where are you? We're lost out here. My blood turned to ice. That's impossible, I whispered. Ren? Kellen. Now it was Nico's voice, coming from a different direction. Why did you leave us? We're hurt and we need help. Torres grabbed my arm as I started toward the door. Don't, he said firmly. It's not them, but they sound. It's not them, he repeated, his grip tightening. Whatever you heard happened to your friends out there, they're not coming back. These things they learn, they absorb, they take the voices of their prey and use them as bait. The voices continued, becoming more desperate and pleading. They begged us to come outside, to help them, to not abandon them in the darkness. And underneath the familiar words, if you listened carefully, you could hear something else. A quality to the voices that was just slightly wrong, like a recording played back at the wrong speed. Please, Eli's voice called out, now tinged with what sounded like pain. Something's wrong with my leg. I can't walk. Don't leave me out here alone. Ren started toward the door, tears streaming down his face. That's Eli, he said. I have to help him. Torres and I both grabbed him, holding him back as he struggled against us. It's not Eli, I said, my voice harsh with desperation. Eli is dead. We heard him scream, remember? But he sounds hurt, Ren sobbed. What if he's alive? What if they're both alive, and we're just leaving them out there? The voices changed then, becoming angry, accusatory. You're just going to hide in there like cowards. Nico's voice snarled, the familiar tone now carrying a venom that the real Nico had never possessed. We're your friends, and you're abandoning us. Some friends you are, Eli's voice added. the words dripping with contempt. Running away and leaving us to die. I always knew you were selfish, Kellen. Ren too, only caring about yourselves. The psychological assault was almost worse than the physical threat. These things knew exactly how to hurt us, how to twist our guilt and fear into weapons against our own sanity. The worst part was that a small part of me wondered if they were right, if we had abandoned our friends, if we were cowards for running instead of fighting.
Torres must have seen the doubt in my eyes because he grabbed me by the shoulders and forced me to look at him. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "I've seen what these things do to people. Your friends are gone. What's out there wearing their voices isn't human anymore."
As if to prove his point, the voices began to change, becoming distorted and unnatural. Eli's laugh became a sound like grinding metal, and Nico's words started to overlap with themselves, creating an impossible chorus of accusation and pain. The facade was breaking down, revealing the alien intelligence beneath. "They're testing the building," Torres observed, watching as dust began to fall from the ceiling beams, looking for weak points. The scratching sounds intensified, coming from all sides now. Something was moving around the entire perimeter of the station, probing and testing. The windows began to rattle in their frames, and I could see shapes moving past them, tall, dark silhouettes that blocked out the moonlight as they passed. "How long until sunrise?" I asked, grasping at the hope that these creatures might be vulnerable to daylight. Torres checked his watch. "About 4 hours." The lights went out completely then, plunging us into absolute darkness. The only sound was our labored breathing and the continued scratching from outside. Torres's flashlight clicked on, casting a weak beam that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness after only a few feet. "Stay close," he whispered, "and whatever happens, don't go near the windows." But even as he spoke, I could hear the sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the building. One of the windows had finally given way under the pressure, and something was making its way inside. The temperature dropped even further, and our breath began to mist in the flashlight beam. Frost started forming on the metal surfaces in the room, spreading outward like fingers of ice. Whatever was coming through that window brought the cold with it, not just the absence of heat but something actively hostile to life itself. A sound echoed through the station that made my bones ache, the grinding voice of the largest creature, the one that had spoken to us at the campsite. But now it wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the building with us. "Found you," it said, the words seeming to come from everywhere at once. Torres raised the shotgun and fired in the direction of the broken window. The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second, revealing a nightmare tableau. One of the creatures was indeed inside, crouched near the shattered window like a spider ready to pounce. Its eyes reflected the light like mirrors, and its mouth was open in what might have been amusement. The buckshot seemed to have no effect on it at all. If anything, the creature looked pleased by Torres's defiance. "Run," Torres said quietly, never taking his eyes off the creature. "Go out the back door. I'll hold them off as long as I can." "We're not leaving you," Ren said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you are," Torres replied firmly. "Someone needs to survive this. Someone needs to tell people what's really happening up here." The creature in the room tilted its head, studying us with those alien eyes. "No one will believe them," it said, its voice like stones grinding in a mill. "No one ever believes the survivors. That's what makes this fun." Torres fired again, and this time the creature moved with inhuman speed, avoiding the blast entirely. It flowed across the room like liquid shadow, its claws leaving deep gouges in the wooden floor. "Go," Torres shouted, working the shotgun's action. We ran for the back door, crashing through it and into the cold mountain air. Behind us we could hear the sounds of struggle, Torres shouting, the creature's inhuman laughter, the splintering of wood and metal. Then abruptly, silence. The forest around the station was alive with movement. Shapes flitted between the trees, and glowing eyes watched us from the darkness. But they didn't attack immediately. They were herding us again, driving us towards some predetermined destination. We ran through the forest, guided only by moonlight and the terrible certainty that staying still meant death. The creatures followed but didn't pursue, content to let us exhaust ourselves in the maze of pine and shadow. They knew these mountains better than we ever could, and they were in no hurry. As we stumbled through the undergrowth, I began to notice something that filled me with a new kind of dread. The trees around us weren't random. They were arranged in patterns, subtle geometries that hurt to look at directly. The creatures hadn't just claimed this forest, they had shaped it, turning it into something that existed partially outside normal reality. We broke through a line of trees and found ourselves on the shore of Mirror Lake again. Our abandoned campsite sat in the moonlight like a grave marker, the cold ashes of our fire a reminder of how naive we'd been just hours before. "How?" Ren gasped. "We ran for miles, but I was beginning to understand. Distance didn't work the same way in this place. The creatures controlled the very geography, bending space to their will. We hadn't been running away from them. We'd been running exactly where they wanted us to go. The creatures emerged from the tree line around the lake, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like stars. There were more of them now, dozens maybe, all focused on us with that terrible alien intelligence. They had gathered to watch the end of their hunt. The largest of them stepped forward, its presence like a weight on my soul. "You ran well," it said, approval evident in its grinding voice. "But all hunts must end." That's when I saw them, Eli and Nico, standing at the water's edge. But they weren't human anymore. Their skin had taken on that same bark-like texture as the creatures, and their eyes glowed with that cold alien light. They still looked like my friends, but everything that had made them human was gone, replaced by something vast and hungry and utterly without mercy. "We've been waiting for you," Eli said, his voice the same but wrong, like an echo of an echo. "It's time to join us." The creatures began to close in, moving with that same fluid grace. But as they approached, the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The creatures stopped, their heads turning toward the growing light, with what looked like annoyance. "Dawn," the largest creature said, its voice carrying a note of frustration. "The game ends for now." As the sun crested the mountains, the creatures began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Even the corrupted forms of Eli and Nico vanished with the retreating darkness, leaving Ren and me alone on the shore of Mirror Lake. We sat there in the growing daylight, too exhausted and traumatized to move. The forest around us looked normal now, just trees and rocks and mountain lake. But I knew it was an illusion. Come nightfall, the hunting ground would return, and the creatures would resume their eternal game. Hours later, a search and rescue team found us. We told them about Torres, about the ranger station, about everything that had happened. But when they investigated, they found no sign of Torres or any disturbance at the station. The building was locked and undisturbed, covered in a layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been occupied in months. The official report listed our friends as missing, presumed dead due to exposure and wild animal attacks. Torres was listed as being on vacation in another state, though no one could explain how he'd managed to be in two places at once. Ren moved to the East Coast shortly after that trip, and I haven't seen him since. We both carry the weight of what we experienced, but we've learned that some truths are too large and too terrible for the world to accept. The creatures were right. No one believes the survivors. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear their voices. Eli and Nico calling to me from the darkness, asking why I left them behind. And I know that somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains, the game continues. The creatures are still there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble into their hunting ground. The beautiful lake still reflects the stars. The pine trees still whisper in the mountain wind. And the darkness still holds horrors that human minds were never meant to comprehend. And every night, when the sun goes down and the shadows grow long, the hunt begins anew. I stick to the city now. The closest I get to nature is the park down the street from my apartment, where the only creatures that hunt are pigeons looking for breadcrumbs. Some things are better left unexplored, some places are better left alone. But sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I really escaped at all, or if I'm still running through that cursed forest, forever pursued by creatures that exist in the spaces between reality and nightmare, while my real body lies broken somewhere on the shore of Mirror Lake, feeding the hungry darkness that dwells in the heart of the wilderness. The truth is, I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's the most terrifying realization of all, that escape might be just another layer of the game, another form of psychological torment, designed by intelligences so alien that their very existence threatens to unravel the fabric of human understanding. In the end, we all became part of their story. The only difference is that some of us are still telling it,